Damn it, David, I don't want to just take off and lay around the damn beach with you. I'm sick of Miami and have more important things to do than move all around the country with you. That's all you want to do anymore. We're young. We need to live it up before it's too late. I'm sick of you telling me I can't go out with my friends. I have a life, and if you want to share it, you need to change your ways. Just because I agreed to marry you doesn't give you the right to tell me I have to go on trips with you, or I have to stay home and not go dancing and partying with my friends. God damn it, David, I'm not some 40-year-old soccer mommy who has nothing better to do than haul a bunch of kids around. I have better things to do than sit around my house and visit on the phone or barbecue on the weekends. I'm young and I need to enjoy. David felt his stomach knot up as he listened to Kathy Vanderbilt, his fiancée. It had taken him over a year to get over the breakup of his last romance and losing his parents in their auto accident. Kathy brought him out of his depression and made him glad to be alive once more. He had met her by accident one day in the building he worked in on Wall Street. He had been late for a meeting and she had too. They were rushing for the elevator and she tried to beat him through the door. She rushed past him from behind and brushed against him, causing them both to drop items they were carrying for their meeting. Instead of one of them getting the sole remaining space on the elevator, neither of them made that car because they had to stop and pick up their charts and briefcases. David had apologized profusely and helped her to pick up everything even though it was her fault they dropped their documents and briefcases. They both explained why they were late and caught the next elevator. When they got to the 25th floor, David turned left for his meeting and Kathy turned right. At that point, they had not even exchanged names. David made it to his meeting room and saw at least that he was not the last person to arrive. He hurried to set up his easel and flip charts, then checked to be sure his PowerPoint presentation was set up properly and ready to go. David's boss came into the room and looked around. He frowned, then said, "David, for some reason the other representative from Jones and Bancroft is late. I have called her office and they told me she left their office early enough to get here on time. Everybody just hang loose until we see what the problem is." As the managing partner turned to leave the room, the woman David had bumped into came bustling past him and into the room. She almost knocked him down as she had David in the elevator. She was red as burgundy wine with embarrassment. She stopped just inside the room and saw everyone standing or sitting waiting on her. She gave a slight smile and said, "I'm so sorry to be late. I was rushing for the elevator and some bumpkin ran into me. I think he must have just F John off the potato wagon." You could cut his hillbilly drawl with a knife. He was blocking the door to the elevator and bumped into me when I tried to get past him. I dropped everything I was carrying and had to pick it up. When I got to this floor, I got turned around and went the wrong direction when I exited the elevator. I hope I didn't cause too big a problem for you all. Mr. Goldstein, the managing partner, smiled and said, "No real problem at all, Kathy. You're the last one of your team to arrive, and all my team is here, so let's just get started." He pointed at David and said, "This is our vice president for new issues, David Dyer. He'll make a short presentation, then we'll answer any questions you may have. As far as we can determine, the publicity associated with the new issue of your company's bonds and the coupon rate has resulted in an oversubscription. Since the desire for the issue is so high, we might consider raising the amount of the offering or selling them at a premium. In fact, that is the main point we want to discuss with your team." David remembered looking up at the beautiful woman, standing staring daggers at him. He smiled and walked to his podium, turned to face the rest of the room, and said in his best country drawl, "Well, if everyone will take your seats, we can get started now. Ms. Vanderbilt, I want to apologize once again for our mishap at the elevator. I just didn't understand how important it was that you got onto it first. After all, anyone knows someone stepping into an elevator should jump out of the way of a juggernaut heading for a collision with them. I guess I had better get the eyes in the back of my head checked so I can see you from now on." David waited for the laughter to die down, then began his presentation. He smiled inwardly at the deep red hue and obvious embarrassment on Kathy's face. He knew he shouldn't have said what he did, but he was tired of self-important people throwing their weight around. She acted like most of the other women he met here in the city. She came across as arrogant and high maintenance, and he didn't like that type of woman. Both the girlfriends he had after he moved to New York had been like that, and he was through with that type of woman. Sometimes he wondered why he ever wanted to move away from the farm. No amount of money was worth the hassle he went through some days. He was disgusted with the city for so many reasons. He had been raised to believe you succeeded on your own merits, your own hard work. It seemed here in the city you succeeded by backstabbing your friends and co-workers, by making the competition look bad instead of by working to make yourself look good. He hated the fake friendship and camaraderie, the mandatory parties and social functions. Truthfully, he was about ready to quit his damn job and move back home where he could live a good life with real people. He had enough money saved and invested he could live well on a lower-paying job back in his home area. David smiled and began his presentation. He had the numbers in line and, like many Wharton MBAs, he knew his stuff forwards and backwards. Many times he saw the shock and admiration in his audience's eyes as he answered their questions. One of the men from the company issuing the bonds was a sharpshooter. David could see his anger seething below the surface as he turned aside. His verbal jabs or his answers made him look bad. David felt his presentation went well, and from the way his boss looked, so did he. Finally, everyone agreed on the changes to the offering. They instructed the responsible parties to complete and file the requisite paperwork and get the issue placed. Kathy remained seated after the meeting broke up. She pretended to be arranging her files and placing them back into her briefcase. She was very slow and methodical. It was obvious she was delaying her departure. Finally, she and David were the only two persons in the room. She looked up at him and stood. David watched as she walked toward him with a guilty, childlike look on her face. When she was near him, she stopped and put her hand gently on his forearm. "Mr. Dyer, I am sorry for the way I behaved both when we ran into each other and when I came into the room today. I know I acted like a 304 and I am truly sorry. I was so nervous I dithered too long in my office that I could not get a cab. Then when I got here I rushed to the elevator and tried to brush past you, so I would not have to wait for another one. I caused the problems and then I didn't have the decency to fess up when I got here. Please, since it's past quitting time, can I take you out for a drink and make it up to you?" David had every intention of telling her to forget it and to walk out of the room. He surprised himself when he heard his voice agreeing to go with her. That was the beginning of their romance. It was after 2 a.m. when he stumbled into his apartment that evening, and he was besotted with Kathy Vanderbilt. He had learned she was a very distant relative to the Vanderbilts and was a very driven woman. They had exchanged addresses and phone numbers that evening. Kathy had agreed to a date the following Friday before they went their separate ways that night. Over the next year, David found out Kathy was a party animal, a socialite, and, like his other New York girlfriends had been, she was high maintenance. Several times he tried to break it off, but he just could not do so. He was in love despite his dislike of some of Kathy's likes and desires, some of her habits and mannerisms. It was obvious by her actions and statements that she felt she was better than many of the people she was forced to interact with. He was embarrassed many times when they were out by the way she treated people who served them. In spite of her many shortcomings, David was empty when she was not with him. He could not get enough of her. She was so special when she laughed and flirted with him, when she loved him. Finally, he decided he had to have all of her all the time, and he asked her to marry him. Much to his surprise, she hesitated. They had been lovers for 9 months by that time, and had lived together for 6 months. She professed to love him, but she took over a week to agree to marry him, and he had to ask her repeatedly before she finally sighed and said, Okay, I'll marry you. Geez, you whine about it like a little boy." David was hurt by her comment when she accepted his proposal. To this day, he did not know why he let it pass. For the last 3 months, Kathy had been getting more and more difficult to be with. She refused to stay home with him. Many evenings, she would not even come home until after midnight. Other evenings, she would come home from work and clean up, change clothes, and go out again to meet her friends for various reasons. David was almost never invited to join her any longer because she told him he was a spoilsport. She rarely agreed to go anywhere he wanted to go or visit anyone he wanted to visit. One time she had even said, "Honestly, I don't know why I put up with your country attitude. This is the Big Apple country boy. Get a life, go out, party, and live a little." David obtained the name of spoilsport because he took exception to the way she danced and acted with many of the men she met at the bars and affairs she or they attended. He told her she was an engaged woman and the way she acted in the bars and with her friends were not appropriate for an engaged woman or a married one. Of course, that was one of the reasons he had been excluded from her nights out lately. He had followed her a time or two and never saw her do anything totally outrageous, but many of her actions made him uncomfortable from a fiancé's perspective. Many of the mannerisms he found so attractive and endearing during their early courtship now made him uncomfortable because she was still flirting and using them with other men. David shook himself and turned his mind from his memories to once again address his fiancée Kathy. He felt his lips press together and jaws clench. He forced himself to relax, then he began speaking. He said, "Kathy, you have been acting like a spoiled brat and a selfish woman now for 3 months. We need this time away to reconnect and relax. I know both of us have high-pressure jobs, and we have to work long hours, but we can't go on like this. It's only 6 weeks until our wedding, and we need to reconnect with each other to see if this is truly what we want. We need this week away to fix our relationship. I'm scared it will not last if you don't change your outlook. In fact, I am not sure we are not irreparably broken now. When you agreed to go last week, I made all the reservations. Hell, you even packed your suitcase yesterday, and now you tell me you aren't going? The limo will be here anytime. We are going, and we are going to settle this once and for all. David grabbed Kathy's hand and pulled her to the front door of their condo. He handed her the suitcase she was using. He stepped to the door, opened it, picked up his suitcase and her overnight bag, then ushered her out. When he turned from locking the door, he saw the limo waiting and the driver helping Kathy into the back. David walked up and handed the bags he was carrying to the driver and started to get into the limo. He heard Kathy talking on her cell during all this. She was saying, "He's being a total shit about the whole thing. I've had it with his crap. Yeah, that's a good idea. I'm looking forward to it." Kathy smiled and continued, "Great. See you there. At least I'll get something out of this week." Kathy looked up at David with anger in her eyes as she closed her phone. She did not say a word as they rode to the airport. The whole flight to Miami was filled with silence. The only time Kathy spoke was when absolutely necessary. David felt his anger build until he could barely hold it inside. He was ready to admit this was a very bad idea and that his marriage might be in danger of never occurring. He decided if she didn't improve her attitude in the next couple of days, he would ask for his ring back and end it. He absolutely refused to put up with crap like Kathy was dishing out. When they arrived at their resort and got settled in, David suggested they go out for supper and dancing. At the mention of dancing, Kathy's eyes lit up and she got a huge grin on her face. She quickly agreed and asked where they were going. David told her, then suggested she go clean up, then he would shower while she dressed. David walked into the bedroom after his shower and heard Kathy on her phone. She said, "Yeah, supper, then we'll be at the beach club for dancing after." "Oh yeah, I'm looking forward to it." Kathy giggled and continued, "Yeah, doing it like this is so exciting. I just can't wait to see his face when it goes down. I get such a charge out of doing it like this, it makes the whole shitty time worth it almost." "Well, see you when we get back." David felt a little better when he heard her say she was looking forward to the night. He felt some of the knots relax in his body and turned back to the sitting room to finish dressing while he waited for Kathy. He did wonder what she was planning that she was so excited about. From the sound of her conversation, Kathy might be planning a surprise for him. He hoped so. Conversation at the meal was strained but somewhat pleasant. It appeared Kathy was looking forward to the dancing, and that made David happy. She also said she was really looking forward to the night after the dance and to the rest of the week. They got to the club and danced several dances. A time or two other men asked Kathy to dance. She was always polite and asked if she could. David grudgingly gave his permission. By the end of the evening, Kathy and one of the men had quit asking him if she could dance with the stranger. She was almost dividing her time between David and the other tall, well-built man. David felt uneasy at that first because the man looked slightly familiar, and secondly because they seemed much too interested in each other, much too familiar with each other. Finally, near 1 a.m., David convinced Kathy to return to their resort. When they got there, they showered together to wash the smoke off, then adjourned to their bed. David had to almost force his way into the shower with Kathy, but she then relaxed and seemed to enjoy his attention. From past experience, David knew if he could ever get her started, Kathy was a sex machine. They had sex in the shower before they finished cleaning themselves. After they dried off, David and Kathy staggered to the bed. They continued their loving on the bed. After several minutes of kissing, nibbling, and small talk, they made love once more. David was heartened and moved to cuddle against Kathy's back. David smiled because Kathy seemed much more ready for lovemaking, more enthusiastic than she had been for several weeks. He was slightly upset when after they finished, she had tried to move away from him, however. She had not made an issue of him cuddling up to her, though. She had just seemed to drift off to sleep lying in his arms. When their romance was young and new, Kathy used to cuddle after they had sex. Her attitude worried David, but he let his worries fade as he drifted off into a deep slumber. The next morning, David awakened late. He saw by the clock it was after 10 a.m. Kathy was not in bed. He walked nude into the sitting area of the condo, and she was not there. After more search, he found her purse missing too. Finally, he decided she had gone out for breakfast or something, but besides being worried, he was upset. She could have waited on him, or even awakened him if she was in a hurry. He sighed and thought to himself, this is just another indication that things are going badly wrong. She would have never done this a few weeks ago. We were inseparable and always waited on the other for breakfast on the weekends or on a trip. I have a lot more repair to do than I thought. As the day wore on, David got more and more upset. Kathy did not call. She did not come back for lunch. David decided she had gone shopping, but then she did not come back for supper. He stayed up until after midnight, and she still had not returned. Finally, he called the police, but they had no information on her. He was told he could not report her missing for at least 24 hours. He had a sleepless night. The next morning, Kathy was still missing, and David reported her as such to the police. He gritted his teeth and called her parents. David was very surprised when her father said, "Oh, I wouldn't worry about it, David. I'm sure everything is fine. Why don't you just enjoy your trip and relax?" At the time David was talking to her father, Kathy was laying on her back, giggling in another hotel room down the block from the hotel David was in. After she heard David end the phone call with her father, Kathy turned to the man who was in bed with her. She pulled him up and gave him a deep, sensuous kiss. He grinned when he felt her pulling him over her for the third time that day. The tall blonde man did not even know David, but he hated him. He had struggled all his life to get ahead, and he hated people like David and, in truth, like Kathy. He felt he fought for everything he had, and they just had it handed to them because they came from family or from a good college. Kathy was not the first woman he had stolen from men like David, but if she was as rich as he thought she would be the last for a while. He fully intended to marry her and live like he felt he was entitled. When a richer woman came along, he would trade up. He just hoped he didn't have to sign a pre-nuptial agreement when he married Kathy. He had been dating her now for several months and was sure he could talk her into marrying him when the time came. After all, hadn't he taken her from the a-hole she was engaged to? David stayed in Miami the whole week as planned, hoping to find out something about Kathy. He phoned her parents and all the friends whose phone numbers he had over, hoping they had heard from her. Some of Kathy's friends were evasive, even abrupt when he talked to them. Many did not even answer their phones. He had no luck finding her. Most of the people he phoned said they did not know they had even left town. Finally, the Thursday morning before he was to return home, David called her parents once more to report he still knew nothing. That morning he was surprised when her parents seemed upset with his call. The first morning they had been as frantic as he had been. The calls he made after his first report of her going missing, they had seemed strained, and he decided they were worried enough they weren't themselves. One of her friends laughed when he called her to ask about Kathy. She then said, "Well, that sounds like Kathy." She then just hung up her phone. David packed both bags and returned to New York. He was surprised when he packed Kathy's bag to find she had brought almost no cosmetics and only some of her older clothes and swimwear. The day he returned to work, he looked like hell. He was totally ineffective. His boss asked him what the problem was, and when he told him, he laughed. All he would say was, "Welcome to the club, boy." After he got back to New York, he once again checked with all of Kathy's friends he could find. Some of them looked like, or said they were sorry, but none of them seemed too worried about Kathy. Many of them would not look him in the face when he talked to them, and many looked guilty when he saw them in person. He even called her employer and was told they were sorry, but they couldn't tell him anything about Kathy. This statement bothered him. He was never passed on from the operator. It was almost as if they were expecting his call and told to run interference. When he tried to dial her desk directly, he got a voicemail message that, "Ms. Vanderbilt is away from her desk right now. Please leave a message after the beep." He left a message, but his call was never returned. Finally, David decided to watch Kathy's office. The third evening, he stood outside watching the door. His heart broke. He felt himself burn with the heat of his rage. Kathy came out the door walking with a tall, well-built blonde man. Her arms were wrapped around his left arm, and she was gazing rapturously up into his eyes as they walked. When they stopped to hail a cab, she stood on her tiptoes and gave him a deep kiss. David recognized him as the man she had been dancing with their first night in Miami. Now he knew. Kathy had moved on just like the other high-maintenance city women had done. David rapidly walked up to Kathy and her new man. He grabbed her arm and twisted her toward him. He was not exceedingly violent, but he was not gentle with her either. David glared at Kathy and said, "You cheating little 304. I knew something was wrong, but you should have at least had the courtesy to end our engagement face to face instead of just walking out and leaving me to worry for over a week." David grabbed her hand and removed his engagement ring against Kathy's resistance. She began screaming and trying to close her fists to keep the ring. Kathy said, "You a-hole. I got fed up with your damn whining and complaining. Why wouldn't I move on to a man more in tune with my lifestyle? Now get your hands off me. That's my ring and I intend to keep it. You gave it to me, and I have no intention of giving it back to you." Kathy's new beau had recovered by this time and pushed David away from her. David turned to him and said, "Back off, a hole. You may be taller than me, but I'll tear you apart if you don't quit screwing with me. I ought to beat you to a pulp anyway for what you did." The man backed away a step and watched David as he finished taking the ring from Kathy. He looked at her and her new fellow and said, "I knew when I first saw you that no sane man should get involved with you, but I just couldn't help myself. I guess I got what I deserved." David turned and slowly walked back to the parking garage and his car. All the way he kicked himself mentally because in the back of his mind, he had always known Kathy was like that. He had seen her selfishness, how self-centered she was, all through their courtship and engagement, but had refused to believe it. He now knew beyond a shadow of doubt that he was just a passing fancy, a fling for another conceited party girl. He was angry. He hired a PI to follow her and get information for him. She had already moved into the house of her new lover. Somehow they got pictures of them making love. David boxed up Kathy's belongings that had been left in his home. While he was boxing them, he noticed there did not seem to be as much as he thought there should be. None of what he found could be considered important to her. Only old clothes, no important personal items or business papers were left in his house. He then knew she had came home while he worried over her and taken what she wanted from his house, leaving her old outdated items just as she had at the resort. David felt his anger building once again as he considered Kathy's actions. He was fed up with his job and the people he worked with. He was sick of New York and all that lived and worked the Big Apple. He decided to quit his job, sell his condo, and move back to his childhood home. It would not be the same with all his family dead and gone, but he still had friends there. He still had a score to settle with Kathy and her new man before he left, but other than that, he had nothing holding him in New York any longer. Hell, he had even made enough money he could live pretty well when he got back home. David decided to tell Kathy's friends and parents what she had done to him. Hopefully, he could make enough of a scandal that her reputation would be tarnished. Maybe he could prevent what happened to him from happening to another man. Then when his condominium sold, he would quit his job and leave. Much to David's surprise, when he began looking up her friends and family to tell them what Kathy had done, they laughed at him. Almost every one of her acquaintances admitted they already knew how she dumped him. Haley, one of her female friends that was nicer to David than most, apologized to him for not telling him when he had first called. She said, "David, I am sorry this happened to you, and I can imagine how you hurt, but let it drop. This is just typical Kathy. You're not the first man she dumped like that. One time she went to France with a man, stayed the whole week with him, then cut out. This is her normal way of ending a relationship when she decides she has gotten everything from it she can. She usually finds a new man, moves in with him, and then just walks away from her old boyfriend without telling him anything. Many times she does it on a trip like she did you. That seems to be her preferred way of ending a relationship. I think she gets a kick out of seeing or knowing how her exes come apart, thinking she has actually been hurt or kidnapped. Most of the dumped men stay gone the entire time, like you did trying to find her. That gives her time to get what she wants from their apartment, move, and begin to hide her tracks. We all know better than to spill the beans on her because she can be so vindictive. One time, one of her friends at work told the man she was dumping she had left him before Kathy finished moving the personal items she wanted from his apartment. Kathy worked for months until she manufactured a reason for her employer to fire the tattletale. We are all afraid to rat her out. I am sorry, but I just couldn't take a chance and tell you. My advice to you is to drop it and move on. She has friends all over, and she can make life very difficult for you if you cause her trouble. She has a regular stable of men in powerful places that she makes love to regularly. These men jump to help her when she asks, so she won't cut them off or rat them out to their wives. Right now she is happy and content knowing what she did to you and knowing how you suffered. Don't piss her off or she'll get vindictive on you. If she can't hurt you to her satisfaction, she will get some of her powerful lovers to do it for her." David was shocked when he heard that and said, "You're kidding." It seemed like it was. I can't believe Kathy would do something like that. I admit I was beginning to suspect what she was doing was more than nights out with her girlfriends, but I just can't believe she had lovers all during our engagement. Believe it, Romeo. I can't give you proof, but all of her friends have seen her with other men during all her dating and engagements. Kathy is out for Kathy, and anything that will make things better for her is okay. She never dates or has sex with a man unless she thinks she has something to gain. Her goal is to regain the wealth her family had in the past, and she is well on her way to it. I know from talking to her that you spent a lot of money on her, giving her jewelry, expensive clothes, trips, and so forth. During the time she lived with you, she didn't spend hardly anything of her own salary. She bragged that you set up a joint account with her so she could pay household bills and so forth. Didn't you ever wonder why so much of that money disappeared? I bet it didn't get spent, lover. David felt ill. He thought about what Haley said and knew she was right. He always had to put more money into the account. When he complained Kathy had just blew him off and said things were more expensive now. He was glad now he didn't put all his salary into that account, or she might have spent or taken it all. David decided it was a waste of time continuing to inform her family and friends what Kathy had done. It was obvious that everyone already knew what Kathy had done and didn't really care. David hired a PI firm to follow Kathy. He had her followed for a month, and he requested information on the men and women she made love with during that period. He obtained a used computer and began sending emails with pictures of Kathy and her lovers to everyone he knew who knew her. He always used a public Wi-Fi connection so the message could not be traced to him. He sent pictures of her nude and in compromising positions. When possible, he sent pictures and explanations to the wife or girlfriend of her lovers. If he didn't have their email addresses, he used snail mail. David began hearing of marital and relationship troubles in many families who knew Kathy. Now she was becoming the favorite gossip subject with those who knew her or knew of her. Many of her friends were avoiding her, trying not to get splattered with the shit storm she had raised. By now, it had already been almost 6 months, and Kathy was getting bored with the man that had replaced him. She was once again shopping for a new man. David caught her and took pictures of her doing inappropriate things, petting, and once even having sex with another man in public. These pictures were sent to his list of people. He made sure copies of the pictures were given to her new lover. It seems he became very angry with Kathy. In fact, he hit her and ended up in jail over that. David thought that was poetic justice. Kathy's life began to unravel. Every time she was seen with another man more than once or twice, he got a synopsis of her past actions. Many of them dumped her outright. Others just used her for sex. Then, when she began hinting about moving in with them, they dumped her. Kathy was furious that someone would smear her like that, but she could not find out who was doing it. She and her family even hired a PI, but had no luck. Finally, she lost her job because David had caught her having sex with 2 of her superiors and one of her subordinates on company time. Even worse, she was doing it in company offices or at company functions. She had to move back into her parents' home. David decided he had done enough to Kathy. He sent her one final package with copies of most of the pictures and notices he had sent to others. The note on top said it all. You have screwed over countless men and made their lives miserable as you used them to make yourself feel better or to better your position. Now you not only know what it feels like to some extent, but you have been reduced to living off your parents once more. Hope you have a nice life. Getting even with the man who had stolen Kathy from him was much easier. David felt like he really didn't need to do much to him because he had been used just as David and many others had. Had Kathy not been wearing his engagement ring at the time, David might have given the man a bye. He followed him into a bar one night, and after he was half drunk, David walked up to his table and sat down uninvited. David held his hand out to shake. He said, "You may not remember me, but I owe you a lot for what you did for me. I want to thank you." The man took his hand and said, "I don't think I even know you. What do you think I have done to help you?" David laughed and said, "Hell fella, you moved in on me and stole my fiancée Kathy Vanderbilt 6 weeks before my wedding. I can't thank you enough for taking that cheating, lying 304 off my hands before I made a serious error and married her. Too bad you didn't last as long as I did, though. She was one of the best pieces of meat I ever had." Recognition flashed across his face, and the young man rose from his chair with a roar. He hit David, causing him to fall from his chair. Before the other patrons, his friends, or the bouncers could get to him, David stood and hit him 3 times. Well, his first punch was a kick to the gonads, but then David drove his knee into his face as he bent forward, clutching himself. As the young man began to fall, David hit him as hard as he could in the face. He heard his jaw break. The man was lying on the floor moaning and clutching himself when David bent down toward him. He said, "I'm sorry, old chap. All I wanted to do was thank you for taking that skank off my hands. I'm glad she is gone, but you really do need to remember this if you ever decide to screw another engaged or married woman. If you hadn't hit me first, I would have never have been this hard on you, though. Hope you've learned your lesson." David walked out of the building before the bouncer could restrain him and before the police arrived. The next morning, he read about an altercation at a hot local nightclub. Apparently, a Jeff Dwight was accosted and badly beaten by an unknown assailant who had escaped. David kept waiting on a visit by the police, but one never came. He felt good, sad about his breakup, but glad he didn't land in jail. A few weeks later, his condo sold. That same day, he gave his notice and quit his job. 2 weeks later, David loaded what little he was taking with him into his vehicle and left, heading back to his home in the Missouri Ozarks. He was the last of his immediate family, and he wanted out of the city. He had not been back to the family farm in almost 10 years, but that was his destination, and he was looking forward to getting there. He had no intention of ever leaving his hometown for more than a vacation ever again. The farm had been in his family since 1882, and it had passed to him when his parents had both died several years ago. He was an only child, and so he added the value of their small estate to the amount he had already saved from his job. He had not been like most of the other high-profile MBAs working on Wall Street. Instead of buying into conspicuous consumption, immediate gratification, he had banked and invested a large percentage of his salary and bonuses. That, too, had been a bone of contention between him and his 3 lost loves. They wanted to spend everything and he made to live the good life. Conspicuous consumption was the password to their hearts. When you ran out of money, borrow, borrow, borrow. The good part about the way he saved his money was that after selling his condo and paying all his bills, he now had somewhat over $3.75 million in investments, excluding the value of his small farm. He could return home and become a hermit if he so chose and live off the interest. David's only concession to extravagance was the purchase of a nice Super Crew F250 Powerstroke 4x4. Of course, this had been another bone of contention with Kathy. She complained about him owning a truck because it wasn't cool. She had refused to be seen with him in it. She said for the same money he could have purchased a good car, a Beamer or Mercedes, maybe even a Lexus. When he had bought it, she was appalled that a dirty old truck cost almost $60,000. He had almost sold it numerous times because of the problems driving and parking it in the city. Now he was glad he had kept it. He loaded all the possessions he wanted to keep into it and a small utility trailer and took off for home. He told no one where he was going when he left his job and told no one in his old hometown he was coming. Except for a small 30-acre field near the riverbank, David's land had lain fallow ever since his grandparents had died 10 years ago. He had a local farmer that watched over the place and used it for pasture as his compensation. The old house had burned down about 5 years previously. Now the only building that was left was an almost new pole barn. It was well after dark the night David pulled into his ancestral land, his new home. He drove under the cover of the barn and turned off his truck. He pulled enough out of the back to make a bed and went to sleep. Over the next few days, David relaxed alongside the river that flowed through his farm and tried to decide what to do with his life. He finally decided to just exist, manage his investments, and see what came up. With that in mind, he knew he needed a warmer place to sleep in the winter, and if the summer was like they usually were, he needed a cool place for the summer. David decided to pour cement on the floor of the barn and build a small living area in one end of it. He would have a garage and shop in the other end. He could hook to the old well and septic system from the house that had burned. He didn't need much and decided to do most of the work himself. It would keep him busy and be fun also. One of David's first tasks was to purchase a 60-horsepower tractor and loader so he could clean up the place. After he had that task completed, he went to town and purchased lumber and pipes so he could get the drains and water lines situated. When that was done, he completed forms for the cement floor, then had the local ready-mix company come out and pour his floor. He did hire a local cement contractor to help smooth the concrete floor so it would be level. David was lucky. There were no zoning laws and building codes he had to worry about in the country. He had all the knowledge necessary to do his own work. When he was young, he worked with his parents and grandparents doing repair work and light building. His father had operated a small building contracting firm, and David had worked there in the summers, so he knew enough to wire, plumb, and build his small home. The barn was tall enough he could make the living area 2-story. Upstairs, he put 2 bedrooms, a bathroom, and small sitting room. Downstairs, he had a large living room, kitchen, and dining room, along with the master suite and bathroom. He built a utility room and small office as a single-story extension behind the kitchen in the garage end of the barn. As the weeks passed, David felt himself relax. He also felt himself become more and more physically fit as he worked and used muscles he did not use working in the city. From time to time, David would go into one of the local towns, either Prineville, the nearest small town and the county seat, or Steelville, a slightly larger town. He would buy his groceries, eat a meal out occasionally at the local cafe, and of course purchase his building materials. He even rewarded himself with some canoe trips down the local river. He fished and watched the city slickers make fools of themselves. Being a red-blooded male, he also admired the scantily clad females playing in and along the river. David became well enough known that the local farmers meeting at the cafe would nod and speak occasionally, but not well enough known to be considered a friend. David did not want to be anyone's friend. He especially did not want to be anyone's boyfriend. He avoided any entanglements with the few waitresses and other local ladies that tried to visit with him. He became a favorite topic of conversation with those women. They began to try and find out where he lived, what he did, and most of all, if he was married, for he was a fine specimen of a man. Prineville was on a large river, and there were a lot of fishing camps, resorts, and canoe rental businesses all along the river from Steelville to Prineville. The river that ran beside his land was slow-moving, and just 3 miles downstream it opened into a beautiful lake. Most of the outfitters were small operations and family-operated. David remembered many times in his youth when he floated and fished in the river. Those were pleasant times, fun times. He decided that next summer he would purchase a canoe, or better yet, a john boat, and take some trips instead of renting, as he had the few times he went on the river this summer. He would also have a large garden and perhaps get a few cattle so he could be self-sufficient as possible. This year, all he had time for was to build his home and prepare for the winter. The summer passed slowly yet much too rapidly. Building a house inside a pole barn didn't lend itself to a beautiful exterior, but the interior could have been in any high-end condo in New York. There were tile floors in the bathrooms and kitchen, deep carpets in the other rooms, and solid wood paneling. The kitchen had stainless appliances and granite countertops. In short, pure luxury, yet it did not cost an outrageous amount because David did most of the work himself. He built a covered porch across the end of the building and down both sides. On the east side, where the master bedroom was, David glassed in the portion of the porch beside the master suite. He placed a hot tub within so he could have a hot tub to use year-round. During this time, David continued to take days off so he could canoe the local stream. He occasionally rented a boat and fished on the local lake, but he much preferred the stream. David became friendly with many of the people who rented canoes and boats along the river. There was one man in Prineville who he just could not warm to, however. Apparently not too many people could though, as he nearly always had canoes to rent. He was always the last place one went to rent a boat because he was so mean-spirited and his place was dirty. He had 2 young women working for him, and he treated one of them like crap. She was skinny and always wore ratty clothes. He made her do the dirtiest, most difficult work while the other woman wore nice clothes and did the cleaner work. David asked around and found out the nicer-looking older woman was the man's sister and was married to the brother of the younger skinny girl. They had taken the girl into their home when her parents died. At the present time, the brother was in Iraq with the army. David was not stupid. He asked around. He watched people, and it was not long before he concluded the young girl's brother's wife was sleeping around. She was a flirt and an adulterer. She reminded David of a country example of his girlfriends from New York. It was obvious she and her brother cared little for either of the siblings. Since the whole town seemed to know Karen was cheating on John, he figured a divorce was in the offing. He felt sorry for John and for Patricia, the young girl. Patricia was a breath of fresh air to David. She was always friendly, most always smiling when he talked to her, unless Jared or Karen had been harassing her once more. Even then, she was nicer than David could have been. He was also impressed because she was a hard worker. When he found out she was not getting paid, David was more impressed with her and more disgusted with Jared and Karen. No wonder Patricia's clothes were ratty and she looked unkempt. She had no money to purchase things for herself. David began to go to Jared's marina first, just so he could talk to Patricia. He hated to give them the money, but that was the only way he could talk to Patricia. Since she was the driver that took the canoes to the put-in point on the river, he got to talk to her during the rides also. If he was really lucky, he was the only customer in the truck, and he could sit in the cab with her. He found himself taking more float trips than he would have just so he had an excuse to talk to Patricia. He always made sure to give her a larger tip so she would at least have some money. At first, she had tried to refuse it, but when he started leaving it in her seat, after she left the truck, she finally agreed to take it. She was always slightly embarrassed to take it, but very appreciative. He did not normally see Patricia in town, but when he did, David usually tried to get her to have either a Coke or coffee with him. Many times, she would. Finally, the summer drew to a close and it became too cool to canoe. David found himself working more and more in the woods, cutting and splitting wood to burn for his winter heat. He had placed a wood stove in his new home and planned to heat with it as much as possible, mostly because he preferred the wood heat. He had cut some wood shortly after he arrived so it could season and dry enough to burn well in the winter. Now he was working on his next year's supply and really enjoying himself. David was working near the stream when he heard a yell. He looked up and saw Patricia in a canoe paddling toward the bank upon which he stood. She beached the canoe and trotted up to him. She was smiling and asked, "Hey David, what are you doing here cutting wood? I hear some rich dude from New York owns this land and doesn't want anyone on the place. Old Hiram runs his cattle here and chases off everyone he can catch on the place." David started to tell her he owned the place, then changed his mind. After all, he really didn't know her well, even though he enjoyed flirting with her when he went canoeing. "Oh, I have an in with Hiram. I keep the place clean and get to take the wood home to burn when I cut it. What are you doing out on the river when it's this cold out?" "Jared made me come out and check for any of his stuff renters lost. I'm also taking down some of his signs and stuff to put away for the winter. He charges for lost items, then when they come back in, if they get found, he doesn't refund the customer's money. He makes a lot selling lost used stuff for new prices. I get to come out here and get all wet and freeze my butt off while he and Karen sit home in a warm room and swill beer. I sure wish I could get away from the a-hole. John says when he gets back from Iraq, we'll move away from the prick and his 304. He's trying to file for divorce on the cheating skank, but doing it long distance is impossible. She gets a cut of his pay and an allotment, then uses it to support Jared and her lovers. I could just kill her. Yeah, been there, done that, and got the t-shirt. That's why I moved back here from New York." David saw Patricia's head jerk up and stare at him when he said that. Then she started to speak. He spoke first, saying, "Shit, guess I'm busted now, aren't I? I was engaged to a damn skank like Karen. She stepped out on me for I don't know how long. Finally, just 6 weeks before the wedding, she left me in Miami and ran off with her current lover. I know how your brother feels." Patricia was staring at David with an angry look on her face. She said, "Why were you trying to make me believe that someone else owned this place? Why were you hiding here?" "Well, I guess I really don't have a good reason. Hell, I don't know, Patricia. I'm sorry. I guess I just wasn't thinking. In the city, it's so dog-eat-dog that information is power, and you try to keep it all to yourself. I guess I really haven't gotten all that slime and deceit out of my system yet. I'm sorry." "Oh, I suppose that's cool. I really don't have any business putting my nose into your affairs anyway. So, what you gonna do with the place? Last I heard, the house burned down, and all that was left was an old pole barn." David looked at Patricia a moment, then said, "Come on with me and I'll show you." He turned and picked up his tools, putting them into the back of his truck. It was only about 1/8 of a mile to the house, but he drove so he could haul back some of the wood he had cut. David opened the truck door and said, "Hop in, Patricia. I won't bite. Hell, I've ridden with you enough, you should know I'm safe." Patricia grinned and jumped into the cab of David's truck. She looked around and said, "Wow, these new Super Cruise are really nice, aren't they? So, where are we going?" David pointed through the windshield at the barn/house and said, "Oh, just up there. I guess we could have walked, but I was about ready to quit, so wanted to take my load of wood and tools back when we went." David pulled the truck into the back part of the building and parked it near a large stack of already split wood. He got out and waited for Patricia, then led her to the door that led into his utility room, then from there into the kitchen from the barn garage part of the building. When Patricia stepped into the kitchen, she stopped and stared. She whispered, "Oh my gosh, this is beautiful. Whatever made you think of turning part of a barn into something this nice?" Patricia walked straight into the kitchen. She ran her hands lovingly over the granite countertops as she stared at the stainless appliances. After another loving look at the kitchen, she walked into the living area and stopped once more. She turned in a circle, her eyes glowing. She faced David and said, "Oh, David, this is perfect." David gave her a guided tour of the entire house, showing her the master suite, then the upstairs. He explained how he could drain the water in the upstairs bathroom and close off those rooms when he did not want to heat or cool them. After the tour, he took her to the enclosed hot tub area. She seemed really impressed with the wood heating stove David had in that room, especially when he explained how it was ducted into the household heating system to heat the entire house. They sat in chairs at a patio table drinking iced tea and talking. All at once, Patricia looked at her watch. She jumped up and screamed, "Oh, damn. I was supposed to be at the takeout point in 15 minutes for Jared to pick me up. Even paddling as hard as I can, it will take me almost an hour to make it. I have to go. Thanks for the tour and the drink. I'll see you in town, I guess." Patricia turned and ran out the door toward the stream and her beached canoe. David just stared as she disappeared in a rush. Throughout the winter, David kept track of his investments, buying and selling stock as he planned his next year. He knew he wanted a large garden for his own use, and since he enjoyed working in the garden, he decided to plant extra and see if he could sell it. He ordered his seeds and talked to the local garden center to make arrangements for them to start the variety of tomato and pepper plants he wanted to grow. From time to time, David saw Patricia in town and they talked. He found out her brother's unit had been extended in Iraq and would not return to the States until midsummer. Patricia said her life with Jared and Karen was getting worse. Karen never did any work now and Jared did very little. Of course, not much needed to be done in the winter except maintenance. Things were tight for her now. In late March, people began to return to the river on nice days to enjoy the spring from the canoe. Of course, that meant Patricia began working more. One nice day, David decided to take a float trip himself before he got bogged down in the spring and summer's work. While she was delivering him and his canoe to the put-in point, Patricia and he visited. David said, "I don't suppose I will get to see you much now for a while. I'm going to put in a large garden, maybe even enough to have a vegetable stand. I think I am going to buy my own canoe or John boat too." David was looking at Patricia as he talked, and he saw a flit of sadness cross her face. She said, "I'm going to miss talking to you. Maybe I'll get to see you in town still though. I've really liked to talk to you." The next Tuesday, David was working in his garden plot when he heard the sound of a paddle hitting the side of a canoe. A little later, he heard someone calling his name from the riverbank. He turned toward the sound and saw Patricia walking toward him from where she beached her canoe. One look at her, and he could tell she was angry. He had never seen her face look as stormy as it was this day. David walked toward her and said, "Hello, Patricia. It's good to see you. Why don't we go over to the chairs? David had some comfortable lawn chairs under a tree beside the river and rest a while. As he walked past it, David picked up the cooler he always took to the garden or woods with him. When they got to the chairs, he sat down and opened the cooler. He turned to Patricia and said, "I have water, Pepsi, or beer. What'll you have?" After they began drinking their beverages, Patricia began to talk. "David, I'm sorry to bother you, but I just had to get away for a while, and you were the only one I could think of to talk to. That skank has moved a boyfriend in with her, and they play kissy face or have sex when there's work to be done. It's terrible what she's doing to my brother, and I get so damn angry. Sometimes I think she is making more noise than she normally would just to make sure I know she's having sex again. I just can't take the way she is rubbing my face in her affairs, knowing there is nothing my brother or I can do about it. Besides that, Jared has been letting his hands roam more than usual. I've been trying to find a job, but no one's hiring, and I don't have the money or a way to get to the city where I might have a better chance. Besides, who'd hire someone with only a high school education now? I'm sorry to unload on you, but you've been so kind in the past. I sort of think of you as a friend. You might be the only friend I have in this town." Patricia broke down crying. Then, with an effort, she pulled herself back together. She wiped her eyes and looked over at David. She took a deep breath, licked her lips, and then continued. "I was thinking last night. You told me a while back that you were thinking about buying a canoe or a john boat for yourself, and I got an idea. David, you're not too far out of town here, and, well, I was thinking if you bought a dozen canoes and a couple of john boats. I mean, if you had that much money, well, I could rent them for you and handle that part of the business. I know where we can get a trailer to haul the canoes on, and we can get an ice machine and sell drinks and stuff too. I could help you in the garden and keep the house. Well, David, I really want to get away from those a-holes, and I think we could make money. I wouldn't need much cash if I could just maybe live in your garage while we worked." David sat there in shock as he watched the emotions play across Patricia's face. He opened his mouth several times to speak, but no words came out. Finally, Patricia grimaced, and he saw fresh tears run from the corner of her eyes. She said, "Bad idea, huh? I'm sorry. I was just hoping because I want to get away so bad." She sighed and said, "Well, guess I better go. I'll have to paddle back upstream, and that's a long pull. Sorry I bothered you." Patricia had stood and started to walk away before David could find his voice. He finally croaked out, "Wait, Patricia, come back a minute. I'm sorry. You just surprised me so much I just didn't know what to say for a moment. I think I can maybe help you. Let's talk about it." Patricia came back to the shade and sat once more. She watched David in amazement. Her eyes were sparkling and her grin couldn't get any wider. She squeaked out, "Really?" in an excited tone of voice. David's face became very serious. He bit his lip and furrowed his brow as he thought. He looked so serious, almost predatory. Patricia had never seen an expression like the one he got on his face. It was almost frightening in intensity. She shuddered and thought she really didn't want him to ever be angry with her. Finally, David began to speak. He said, "Patricia, I had never considered anything like that. I never intended my garden to be much more than a hobby and a way to get food for the winter. I like fresh homegrown and home-preserved food more than what I can buy in the store. I enjoy growing it and know how to can and freeze food, so I decided to grow my own and preserve what I think I will need for the winter. I decided to grow some extra to sell on the spur of the moment. I really don't know why I did that because I don't need the money. Do you know what it would cost to buy the canoes and boats? What else would we need? What would the life jackets, paddles, and so forth cost? I know we would need insurance, an office building, and maybe a small building or room to sell drinks and store the gear. Hell, I guess I could even put in a large cooler for the garden items. As for you sleeping in my garage, no. I can't have you sleeping in my garage. That just wouldn't be right. Even if we don't get boats and canoes, though, I can use your help around here. I'll figure out a fair wage, and you can sleep in one of the upstairs bedrooms. I'll have to buy a bed for you, but..." Patricia broke in and said, "No, I appreciate your help, but I won't take a wage. My room and board is enough. I'll help and work beside you for my food and a place to sleep, but..." David broke into her sentence and said loudly, "No, Patricia, I'll not have you work for free. That's not right. I didn't like it when Jared did it to you, and I'll be damned if I'll do the same thing. We will figure out a fair wage, and I'll pay it." Patricia looked at him as if he had grown horns, then she started in once more. She said, I'll go back to Jared before I let you pay wages for someone to do something you didn't intend to hire anyone to do before I showed up here today." She sat and looked at David for a moment, then she continued, "Tell you what, I'll do all the housework, cooking and so forth for the room and board, and I'll let you give me 1/4 the profits from the garden and marina for my work there. That's my final offer." David sat for a moment in shock, then he felt himself begin to laugh. He laughed until he cried, but he managed to say, "Okay, you win. I've never had to force anyone to take money before. I guess I can live with that." Patricia grinned and held her hand out. "Shake, partner," she said. "When can I come out here and get started?" "Anytime you're ready, I suppose. I have already turned the amount of land I was going to plant, but if I'm going to have help, I suppose I need to plow more up. At least this field by the river had wheat in it a couple of years ago, and I don't have to till sod. We'll talk more about the canoes and boats later." Patricia looked at David, then she asked, "Can we take your truck and get my stuff now? And take a Hole's canoe back too? I really don't have much, and I really want to get out of that shack of his." Over the next 3 weeks, David discovered several things about Patricia, not the least of which was she was a much harder worker than he had ever imagined, and she could cook better than anyone he had ever known. One evening, he asked her how she had learned to cook as well as she did. Patricia looked up at him and smiled. She said, "My parents operated a nice restaurant for years. From the time I was old enough, I had to help on the busy days if I was not in school. At first I was a bus girl, then I began helping in the kitchen. By the time they sold out, I had learned almost all of their recipes. I even tried to get work in some food service establishments, but all they wanted to talk to me about was being waitstaff. I tried that before I came to live with Jared, but I couldn't pay rent even on a slum hovel and still buy everything else I needed." After they had the seeds and plants in the ground, David and Patricia talked about the marina. He decided to purchase some used canoes from a firm that was going out of business. They also had one nice fishing boat and 2 John boats. He decided since it was a package deal, he couldn't refuse the fishing boat. He and Patricia got busy and built a nice building for the office and small store. He put in a large cooler for the drinks and cold food items, as well as produce he hoped to harvest later in the year. During the time they worked together, they developed an easy camaraderie. They always smiled and joked around. From time to time, David would catch Patricia watching him with a serious expression on her face. Once or twice, he asked her what the problem was, but she would only blush and say, "Nothing." Many times during the hottest part of the afternoon, they would stop working and just laze around. Of course, since he lived on the riverbank, and there was a nice gravel bar beside the deep hole, they swam and they spent a lot of time in the river or lying on the gravel bar. The river water was warm, and they would take an air mattress out into the deep water and either lay on it or push it between their legs and sit floating and talking, enjoying each other's company. They spent many happy hours talking with each other and the canoes full of people who would come past. Finally, David decided they had enough of the infrastructure completed that they could begin trying to rent their boats. He put an advertisement in the paper and had several signs made to place strategically trying to drum up business. He even bought a few radio spots. Business began to pick up, and Patricia had to devote almost her entire day to the canoe business. Since the cooler for their produce was in the same building, she collected money for the produce sold also. As the summer progressed, they found out the fishing and ski boat rented better than the John boats, but the canoes were always busy. David stayed busy caring for the vegetables, harvesting, and even preserving what he thought he would need for the winter. In late July, they became so busy they decided to hire an assistant. Patricia called one of her friends that was unhappy with the canoe rental firm she had worked for. They talked her into going to work for them. The new helper gave them a chance to relax a little, even to get away from the place together from time to time. Until they had hired the help, they had been working 7 days a week, 12 to 14 hours a day. One day, while they were in town, Jared accosted them. He was drunk and cursing Patricia for leaving. He blamed her for taking all his business. On the way back to the farm, David and Patricia talked about Jared's statements. She admitted she had noticed they were renting canoes to many people she remembered from years past. They now had to turn business away occasionally because they did not have enough canoes. She looked at David and asked, "David, do you think you could maybe see if Jared wants to sell his canoes? Most of them are old, but they are in pretty good shape, and we could use them and the equipment." "I don't know. I'm not sure I really want to do this type of business. It's getting to where we work 10 or 12 hours a day now, 7 days a week, even with Jody to help out. I don't want to work that hard. I admit the money's good, but I don't want to work 60-hour weeks like I did in New York, especially for this small an amount of money." Patricia looked at David in shock, then said, "What? I thought we were making a lot of money in the business. We are making over $2,000 a week gross now, and that's great. I can't believe you think that isn't much money. How much did you make in New York anyway?" "I'd really rather not talk about that too much, Patricia, but I will say I made more in a month than we will make all season if things go like they are right now." "Wow. I always heard about those rich Wall Street bankers, but I had no idea they made that kind of money. Now I know how you managed to fix your house up so nice." David thought about the question Patricia had posed on purchasing Jared's business until he fell asleep that night. He woke up thinking about her suggestion during the night also. Finally, early the next morning he got up and told her he was going to town for supplies and some coffee. While he was in the cafe, Jared came in. When he saw David, he began to complain about him taking his customers once more. David felt his temper flare. He leaned back in his chair and said, "Damn it, Jared, if you treated people better, your customers wouldn't try to find somewhere else to rent a canoe. Tell you what, if you're so upset with how poor your business is, why don't you just sell out to me? Yeah, you'd like that, wouldn't you, a-hole? Steal my customers, then steal my canoes too. Is that your plan? No, tell you what, why don't we let Dale and Chuck over there look over your equipment and decide what it's worth? They're in the business and should know what it's worth. We'll average the two estimates and I'll pay you that amount for everything, lock, stock, and barrel." Jared sat at his table with his coffee. When Jared thought the cafe owner wasn't looking, he took a bottle from his pocket and put whiskey into his coffee cup. As he sat drinking his spiked coffee, he stared out the window. He stared at the river and his little shack and the equipment scattered around it. Finally, he turned to David and slurred, "Hell, I guess I'll just sell out. Ever since that little 304 ran off, it's been more than me and Karen can do. I've been trying to get more help, but no one around here wants to work no more." Jared got up and almost staggered out of the cafe and across the street to his business. David looked over at the two other rental owners and said, "Guys, I'd really appreciate it if you would do this for me. I know I'm competing with you, but I am mostly taking the customers from the little place I bought out earlier and a few of Jared's. I suppose I get a few customers that you turn away, but that's not really costing you anything. Besides, maybe we can improve our image if we don't have to apologize for some of his hijinks." Dale and Chuck looked at each other for a moment, then Chuck said, "Hell, I'm game if you are." He drank the last of his coffee and stood. He continued, "Come on, let's get her done." They walked straight to Jared's little house and business. He was nowhere to be seen. The three surveyed his equipment, and they had to knock on the door because Jared was still not there. When he finally managed to get the door open, Jared was barely able to stand. The two men gave Jared and David their estimates and left. Jared was upset at the amount and complained he had 3 canoes on the river, so it should be more because of that. After much negotiation, Jared agreed to sell his entire business stock to David for about 30 cents on the dollar of value for new equipment. Before he left, David took Jared back to the cafe and wrote up a sales agreement. They both signed, and David had 2 people in the cafe sign as witnesses. Before he returned home, David hired a couple of local boys to load and bring the canoes and equipment to his farm as soon as possible. One day in mid-July, Patricia came out of the house smiling. She ran up to David and shook a letter at him. She said, "Oh, David, John is finally getting to come home. He says he will be released from active duty before the end of the month and will be home in early August at the latest. I can't wait to see him again." Patricia looked upset then and said, "Oh, I forgot he doesn't have anywhere to stay. I know he won't want to go back to that skank. Crap." David didn't even think before he spoke. He said, "Hell, Patricia, he can stay in the other upstairs bedroom for a while if he wants. I'm not using it, so it's no big deal." David stood a minute, then he began to look sad. Patricia looked at him with some concern, then asked, "David, what's wrong? Hey, if you don't want John to stay here, it's no big deal. I'm sure he can find somewhere else to stay." "No, it's not that, Patricia. I was just thinking that after he finds a place to stay. Well, I guess you'll be leaving me soon, and I really don't want to do all this alone. I'll really miss you too." Patricia looked shocked and stood with her mouth open a moment, then she said, "Oh, I never thought about that. I'm sorry, David. I know you want me out of your house. We'll get busy and find a place as soon as we can. Can I still? I mean, do you still want me to help with the work, or do I need to start looking for a job?" "No, that's not it, Patricia. I meant, no, I would like it if you kept on helping with everything. I need the help now and, oh, hell, David turned and walked away, leaving Patricia standing alone. He felt like his heart had been torn out when he thought of having to live alone again. He and Patricia were almost like strangers again the next 2 days. They talked very little, and when they did talk, they did not have the easy way with each other they had in the past. Late one evening, David looked up and saw a beat-up old pickup coming down his drive in front of a trail of dust. He hoped they did not want to rent a canoe. It was really too late to make it back safely before dark. The truck came to a stop near the store, and a well-built, dark-haired young man got out. He walked up to David, and before he could greet him, the man said, "I'm John Sprightly. I was told in town that my sister Patricia was out here." David heard Patricia yell out, "John!" Then the door to the store slammed closed, and shortly afterward, Patricia flew past him and launched herself into her brother's arms. She hugged him and held him tightly for a moment, then backed away from him. She took his hand and turned toward David. She said, "John, this is David Dyer. After I got fed up with Jared, and your skank I moved out here with him. He's been letting me live with him and help around here for my room and board. Oh, I'm so glad you got back. I have so much to tell you I don't know where to start." David saw John's eyes tighten, and he began to speak. David broke in on him and said, "John, I think you have the wrong idea about Patricia and me. I let her use the upstairs bedroom in my house when Jared made it impossible for her to stay with him. We are partners in this little business now, and she gets part of the profits for her work. I told her you could use the other upstairs bedroom until you find a place to live. I'm sure going to miss her when you take her from me." David couldn't go on and turned away. As he was walking off, he continued, "I'll leave you two alone now. I'm sure you have a lot to say to each other, and I don't want to be in the way." Patricia started off after David, then turned to look at John when he held onto her hand. Finally, she pointed to the chairs beside the river and said, "Let's go over there and get caught up. I have a few minutes before I have to fix supper." Patricia and John talked for almost 2 hours, then heard David calling from the house. He said, "Hey, you two. Supper is ready. We can eat whenever you want." Patricia's eyes got big and she looked almost frightened. She put her hand to her mouth and said, "Oh, I forgot the time and now David's had to do some of my work. Come on, John." When they entered the house, Patricia looked at David and said, "David, I'm sorry I let the time get away from me. I won't let it happen again." David looked at her and John. He saw a flit of anger flash in John's eyes and thought he knew what he was thinking. David smiled and said, "Hey girl, I don't own you. It's no big deal. I was getting my own meals before you came and I guess I will after you leave. I know you had a lot of catching up to do. Forget about it and come eat before it gets cold." Over the next few days, John's attitude began to change. He began to see that the rumors he heard in town and the information he got from some letters from his wife had not given him the true picture of Patricia's and David's relationship. One day, he was outside sort of helping Patricia in the store when he saw David walk past. It was not too busy, so he followed David out to the garden. "Hey David," he said, "can we talk for a minute?" David looked up at John and said, "Yeah, sure. Let's go over to the chairs. Want a beer?" When they got seated and comfortable, John looked at David and began talking. "David, I'm afraid I haven't been a very good guest, and I want to apologize. After watching you and Patricia and talking to her, I know I had the wrong idea about you. I thought you were a damn city slicker taking advantage, and I'm afraid I let my attitude get the better of me. I didn't have a bed to sleep in, and even after the way I treated you, you let me stay in your home. All I can say is I'm sorry, and I hope you'll let me make it up to you." David said, "Hey, no problem. I'm sure some of what you were told was done on purpose. In case you haven't noticed, I'm not liked much better by your wife and her brother than you are." Over the course of the next few days, John helped Patricia and David when he was not out looking for a job. By the end of August, he had about given up finding work. The night before, he looked at his sister and David over the supper table and told them he thought he was going to have to go to Centerton or Springville and seek employment. The day after John had said he might leave, David sat beside John when he took a break beside the river. He looked over at him and said, "John, I'm beginning to think you aren't going to find a job here, and maybe not very soon if you try somewhere else. I've been thinking. It's sure been easier here since you began helping. Next year should be a snap if you would stay. I was wondering if you would like to stay on. If you would like to stay, I'll make you the same deal I made Patricia. You can live upstairs with her, and you can have 1/4 of the profits from the business. There's not much profit in the winter, but I can use some help around here. Maybe you can find part-time work or cut and sell some wood. If you know how to fix things, you might pick up some handyman-type income." John looked at David, then he let his gaze roam over the land. He turned to David and said, "Well, I really like it here, and it doesn't take much for me to live. I had been trying to decide if, we let some of the folks camp down by the river near the swimming hole. I was thinking maybe you would want to put utilities down there and make a real campground. We could charge them more for the spaces then. I think if we did that and expanded your produce crops, we could really have a great little..." John blushed and continued, "I'm sorry. I mean, you could have a great little business. I would be happy working here for you. I really enjoy working with the people we have come in the summer, and I'm happier here with you and Patricia than I have been in several years. Besides, Patricia's cut is enough to live on with the room and board she gets. I'm sure I can get by fine if I can still stay with you too and get 1/4 of the profits. Yeah, I would really like to stay on if you don't mind." David kept busy the rest of the day cultivating his crops. When he parked the tractor in the new machine shed, he walked toward the river. It had become his custom to take a nice leisurely swim after work. If there was no one around, he would just pull his clothes off and dive in wearing his undershorts. If he had a large group of customers still there or campers, he would detour into the store and put on a pair of swim trunks. This day, even though it was dusk, he had to change into trunks. When David walked into the store, Patricia looked up at him and smiled. David waved and went into the restroom to change. Patricia continued talking to their young clerk. When David came out of the restroom carrying his clothes, Patricia was not in sight, but she caught up to him before he got to the river. David looked down and saw she was in her swimsuit also. He raised his eyebrows at her, but said nothing. Patricia smiled and moved closer to David, wrapping her arm around his waist. For a short moment, she laid her head against him, then looked up at his eyes. Patricia moved away slightly then and said, "John told me he talked to you about our idea today. He said you didn't answer him, David. Have you thought about it? I really think it would be a good idea too, and if we do most of the work it wouldn't cost too much more. Heck, we could even build shelters, maybe for people who don't have tents or RVs. I have had several people phone and ask if we have utilities and improved campsites. I have even had a few call wanting to know if we rent cabins." Patricia licked her lips and gave David a worried look, then continued, "I just know we could make a lot more if we did that. Please." David looked at her and said, "I have been thinking about it ever since John mentioned it. Patricia, I'm not sure I want to work that much harder. We already put in 14-hour days during the summer. I know we are making good money. I have even been thinking about enlarging the store. I have noticed some of the neighbors are buying some things here. You know, just last month you talked me into putting in a small snack bar, and now we are kept hopping cooking breakfast, lunch, and dinner. The girls you hired for that are almost overworked. There again, I noticed some of the neighboring farmers are dropping by for lunch since their wives work. You're killing me, girl." By that time, they had reached the riverbank and Patricia grinned. She said, "Oh, Pooh, you're having fun flirting with all the women and talking to all the men, and you know it. Besides, the money just keeps rolling in, and that's making you even richer. I think you just like to complain." Then with a devilish grin, she pushed David over the bank and into the river. David gave out a large yell, then she heard a splash. Patricia looked over the bank and her face turned white. David was floating face down in the river and not moving. Patricia yelled, "David! David, are you okay?" He didn't move or answer. He just kept floating downstream. She screamed and jumped into the river beside David. He had floated downstream from where she had pushed him, and by the time she got to him, Patricia could stand on the bottom of the river. She stood and pulled David's head from the water. Tears were streaming down her cheeks, and she cradled David against her. Through her tears, Patricia said, "Oh God, what have I done? I've killed him." She pulled David to her and held him as she started walking rapidly toward the shallow water, pulling him along with her. All at once, David exploded into action. He stood, picked Patricia up, and threw her back as far as he could into the deeper water. He said, "I told you that you were killing me. What did you expect? I almost died there." When Patricia came spluttering to the surface, her face was red with anger, and she made a beeline toward David once more. He was laughing as she moved up to him. They were in waist-deep water and still having trouble moving. Patricia launched herself at David and began beating him with her fists as she cried and said, "You hole! I thought I had really hurt you. That wasn't funny. Don't you ever do something like that to me again, honey. I just couldn't live any longer if something happened to you." David gasped and took a step back as he tried to block her blows. All at once, Patricia quit hitting David and pulled her hand over her mouth. "Oh," she said. She looked at David with horror and splashed from the river and ran up the bank. David stood a moment longer, then slowly walked out of the stream after her. He watched as Patricia ran past the store and office complex heading toward the house. David slowly followed Patricia. He was partly in shock and partly perplexed. He really couldn't have heard what he thought he heard, could he? Heck, it almost sounded like Patricia had called him honey. It was as if she thought she loved him or something. He hadn't ever done anything to make her think that, had he? Hell, it must have been a misunderstanding. That's it. David spent the next several minutes closing up the office and store, making sure he had the money locked up in the safe and books balanced for the day. When he locked the door, he moved slowly toward his home. As he walked, he looked down toward the river and smiled when he saw the full camp spots and heard all the pleasant sounds of campers settling in for the evening. Children laughing and playing, and the distant sound of one of the neighbors' tractors as they continued with their field work. When he got to the house, Patricia was nowhere to be seen. There was no supper ready or in the process of being prepared. John was just coming downstairs. He looked at David and said, "I think you put your foot into it this time, old son. I haven't seen Patricia this riled up in years." "But what? I guess it really wasn't very funny, but she pushed me into the river, and I just thought playing possum was the thing to do." "Did she say anything else?" "I mean," John just looked at David and said, "Yeah, we had a pretty good talk, but I'm not going there. You two have to work this one out yourselves." He busied himself taking leftover food out of the refrigerator and began heating it for supper. Neither man saw Patricia the rest of the evening. Finally, about 9:30, David said, "I'm beat. Guess I'll call it a night." He stood and walked into his bedroom. After his shower, he went to bed and was asleep almost before he got his head on the pillow. Later that night, he heard a noise, then saw his bedroom door open. From the light filtering into the house from his pole light, he could see a small female form standing in the door. A small voice said, "Honey, I'm sorry. I shouldn't have pushed you. I just don't know what to do around you. What can I say? You've been to New York and been with all those beautiful women, and I'm just a nobody country girl, but I can dream and I love you so." Patricia came quietly into the room and bent down over David's bed. He felt her put one hand on the bed, then she leaned down to him and gave him a gentle kiss on the cheek. He didn't even think. He just reached his arm out and wrapped it around her thighs. He gave a quick jerk and she shrieked as she fell onto his bed across him. He slid his arms around her and pulled her face to his lips searching hers out in the near darkness. They made love. Once done, he gave her a gentle kiss, then rolled off her onto the bed. David felt Patricia throw an arm and leg over him, and then she laid her head on his shoulder. That was all he knew for the rest of the night. He woke to bright sunlight and a heavy weight on his arm. He heard John laughing, then he said, "Well, it's about time. Should I open up or?" Patricia shrieked and jerked in the bed. She grabbed the covers and tried to cover her body as she looked at her grinning brother standing in David's bedroom doorway. "Damn you, John. Get out. Get out right now." When he heard the yelling, David came awake with a start and tried to get up. That was impossible because he was still under Patricia. He stared as John turned from the room laughing. John closed the door as he walked off as Patricia demanded. He yelled through the door saying, "Take your time, you too. I suppose I can handle things for a while longer, but I am getting hungry, little sis." David turned to Patricia and opened his mouth, but no sound came out of it. He looked at her and licked his lips, then found his voice. He said, "It wasn't a dream, was it?" "I'm sorry, Patricia blushed and shook her head no, then leaned in to give David a gentle kiss, stopping him in mid-sentence. She stood and put on her sleep shirt. She looked at David and bit her lip, then turned and rushed from his room and up the stairs to her room. David heard the upstairs shower running as he dressed. When a blushing Patricia came back downstairs, David and John were sitting on the porch drinking coffee and talking about anything except what had happened. Neither knew what to say or how to slay the 5-ton dragon in the room. David looked at John and raised his coffee cup and eyebrows. John nodded his head yes, so David took both cups into the kitchen for a refill. Patricia was busy at the stove frying bacon, eggs and potatoes and onions when David set the cups beside the coffee pot. He walked up behind her and saw her tense up. She stood without moving as he took the final step up behind her. David pulled her back against his body and leaned down slightly until his mouth was beside her ear. He whispered, "Patricia, did you mean it?" Patricia trembled once more, and he saw tears running down her cheeks. She bit her lips and nodded her head yes. David gently turned her from the stove to face him. He looked into her eyes as he slowly moved his face downward. He gave her a gentle kiss, pulled back and looked at her once more. He moved back, and this time their kiss was anything but gentle. They were just pulling apart when John opened the door and said, "Hey, what does a man have to do around here to get a cup of coffee anyway?" David pulled away from Patricia and turned to the coffee pot. As he was pouring 3 cups of coffee, Patricia turned once more to the stove. He placed her cup beside the stove, handed John his, then stepped away, heading for the porch once more. David stopped and turned toward Patricia. He said, "Patricia?" When Patricia turned toward him, David continued, "You're wrong, honey. You have those high-maintenance, selfish City 304s beat hands down. You are so far above them, there's no comparison. It is easy to love someone like you." David saw tears break out and trickle down Patricia's cheeks once more. Her body was shaking as she wiped her face with her fingers. She let out a low whimper as she cried. David moved back to take her into his arms once more. He leaned to give her one more gentle kiss and whispered, "I think I love you too." Patricia stared at his back as he walked out the door. With a sigh, she turned back to the stove to finish breakfast while the 2 men sat on the porch drinking their coffee and watching the world come awake. Her heart was singing and her stomach fluttered while she thought, dreamed, and cooked. A small smile was on her lips as she worked. When the 3 went to work that morning, their help could tell something was different. Not only were they later than usual, but David and Patricia seemed more attentive to each other and more aware of where the other was. John just looked at them with a self-satisfied smirk on his face. A couple of the women who knew how Patricia felt about David looked at each other questioningly and raised their eyebrows. Over the next several days, Patricia and David settled into a more attentive existence with each other. When they walked past one another, they were more likely to touch, to smile at each other. It became common for them to take breaks together and spend time alone in the river or alongside it at the end of the day. Finally, one day while they were floating in the river on air mattresses, David looked at Patricia and asked, "Patricia, would you go to a show and supper with me Friday?" Patricia felt her heart lurch. Her face became blank, and she blushed slightly when she looked over at David. "Yes," she said. "I would love to go anywhere with you." Finally, Friday came, and Patricia was in a dither. The only clothes she had were jeans, shorts, t-shirts, and a few blouses. In short, all she owned were work clothes. She had never thought she would need better clothes. Unless they went to a fast food place, she didn't feel she could dress appropriately. She had to do something, but what? Finally, after breakfast, she reached out and held David's arm when they started for the business. "David, please, I need to talk to you for a minute. I have to know." "David, you know, I don't have any clothes to wear to any kind of nice restaurant. All I own is the clothes I work around here in, and most of them are pretty worn. I know you have taken me to Walmart when I need to buy something for myself, but I never thought about needing nicer things. I don't want to embarrass you if we go somewhere. Can we just forget this, or maybe just go to McDonald's or somewhere tonight? I'll get a good dress next time I'm in Walmart if you want to go somewhere with me again." "No, I want to go out for a nice meal with you, Patricia. I didn't think about clothes. I'm sorry. We'll leave a little early and maybe we can take care of that, but I intend to take you out for a nice meal," David told John, and the help John was in charge that afternoon because he and Patricia had business to attend to in town. David told Patricia to be ready to leave no later than 3 p.m. because they had to stop by some stores for supplies before they had their meal. Patricia was worried about the trip. She put on her best pair of jeans and blouse, but she still felt doubty, especially when David came out of his room in a nice suit. She blushed and turned to run back to her room saying, "Oh, I can't go with you when I look this trashy and you look so very handsome." David grabbed her arm and pulled her toward the door as he said, "No, Patricia, we are going and that's final." Patricia sat on her side of his truck and stared out the window all the way to town. She was hurting inside. She felt so plain, so ashamed of the way she looked. David was so handsome and his suit must have cost several $100s. She had seen the tag on it one day when she was hanging up his laundry and it said, Armani. She did not know what clothes from their cost, but she knew enough to know they were very expensive and very high quality. David drove to the mall and stopped as close to the upscale women's stores as he could. He walked around the truck and opened Patricia's door. He pulled her from the truck and forced her to walk into the first store with him. She resisted and went reluctantly. Tears were noticeable in the corners of her eyes. They walked through one store and stopped a time or two to look at dresses, but David moved on. In the second store, David stopped before a rack of beautiful dresses. One of the young clerks walked up to them. She surveyed Patricia and dismissed her with a sneer. She turned to David and gave him a 1,000-watt smile as she gushed, "Good afternoon, sir. May I help you?" "Yes, I hope so. My friend here has a wardrobe problem. She has lost her luggage, and we have an important supper meeting in less than 2 hours. We need to find a nice cocktail dress and all the accessories in less than 90 minutes. Do you think you can help us with that?" The young lady looked at him with a predatory expression, then glanced once more at Patricia. Her look of disdain crossed her face once more when she looked at Patricia. She turned to David and replied, "Well, I'm sure we can come up with something, but..." David had seen the look, the change of expression, and he recognized it for what it was. He had seen that expression numerous times in New York. Another high-maintenance 304 with delusions of superiority was confronting them. The main difference was she probably wasn't as well off as those other women, and she was not as good at pulling off the attitude. David took Patricia's hand and said loudly, "Forget it. Now that I think about it, I can see you can't help us. We'll just go somewhere else." David and Patricia started to walk away toward the exit. The sales clerk stood staring at them in shock. As they neared the door, an older, well-dressed lady intercepted them. She put her hand out toward them and said, "Excuse me, sir. Is there a problem? I overheard part of your conversation, and if there is a problem, I want to make it right. I'm the manager here, and if there is anything I can do to help, I would be honored to do so." David stopped and looked her in the eyes a moment, then he relaxed somewhat. "I'm not sure. As I told your clerk, we have a wardrobe problem and have less than 90 minutes to correct it now. We need a nice cocktail dress and accessories for a very important meeting. I was interested in one of those dresses in the rack we were standing beside, but now I think we just may move on. I don't like your clerk's attitude, and I refuse to put up with it. With an attitude like hers, I decided we could never find what we needed here, so we are leaving. Please, sir, let me try to help you. I think I know just the thing for your lady." The manager led David and Patricia back to the rack where the clerk was still standing. She was glaring at David. She blushed deeply when her manager said, "Charlotte, I need you to move along. Watch the front for me while I take care of these customers. See if you can finish the evening without running off any more customers." The manager began to pull dresses from the rack and hold them up to Patricia. Some she would put aside and some went right back. Finally, they had 3 to try on. She turned to Patricia and said, "Come along, my dear. We need to hurry if we're going to make your deadline." Patricia turned to David and whispered, "David, I can't afford any of those dresses. The cheapest one is almost $500. That's almost more than I have in my bank account. Please, can't we go somewhere else at least?" "No, Patricia. We have reservations for supper, and we are going. I am going to pay for the outfit, and you're going to accept it. Now go on." "David, please. I can't let you do that. Just take me to Sears or Target, or even Walmart. I'm sure I can find something that'll do." "And oh, Patricia, I don't want something that'll do. I want something that will bring out your true beauty and that will make you feel like the wonderful woman you are. Now go on, please." He turned her and gently pushed her toward the woman who was standing in front of the changing room. Patricia walked toward her with a sick smile on her face. Twice she looked back at David. The first 2 dresses looked good on her, but the third one, oh, how she shone in it. It was a deep electric blue with a full skirt stopping at mid-thigh. It had a plunging neckline, and the back was open almost to her waist. The color set off the color of Patricia's eyes and made her hair glow. She looked sassy, yet dignified and classy at the same time. Patricia stopped in alarm when she saw David's face. His mouth dropped open, and he just stared. He made a twirling motion with his finger. When Patricia had completed the circle, David had a huge smile on his face. David looked at the manager and said, "We'll take it. Now all we need is shoes, handbag, and stockings." He looked at Patricia and said in a quieter voice, "And maybe some under things if Patricia wants." 30 minutes later, they were walking out the store. David was carrying a bag with Patricia's old clothes inside, and she was wearing her new outfit. Her dress complemented David's suit perfectly. All eyes were focused on them as they walked through the mall and out to his truck. David helped Patricia in her door, then rapidly walked to his side and got into the truck. After he closed his door, he turned to Patricia and stared at her. Patricia looked at him with a little fear and asked, "What?" "You are just so beautiful. That outfit is so perfect for you. I'm just so amazed and so proud you came with me tonight." Patricia felt tears gather at the corner of her eyes once more, and she swatted David on the arm. "Oh, hush. You know I'm just a plain old country girl putting on airs. You know what I am and who I am, and it's not beautiful or classy." Patricia smiled then and continued, "But thank you anyway. Now let's go. I'm famished, and you did promise me supper." David drove up to his favorite French restaurant and turned off the engine after parking. Patricia was once more looking frightened. She turned to David and said, "Oh, David, not here. I've heard it costs as much for one meal here as we spend for a week of food at home." Once more, David coerced her to accompany him. When they entered the restaurant, the maitre d' smiled and greeted David. "Mr. Dyer, how nice to see you again, sir, and with a beautiful lady this time too. Right this way, please." Patricia looked at David in shock when the maitre d' addressed him by name. She allowed David to place his hand in the small of her back and gently guide her to follow the maitre d' to their table. Patricia smiled up at the maitre d' when he pulled out her chair and seated her. She felt so special when he placed her napkin in her lap. Patricia dithered way too long over her decision for her meal. She was horrified by the prices. Finally, she allowed David to convince her that he really didn't care what she ordered or what it cost. Patricia ordered chicken ambassador and David ordered medallions of beef. As soon as they ordered, their drinks appeared, followed quickly by their appetizers. David and Patricia finished their appetizers and visited a short while before their salad arrived. Like the appetizer, the salad was wonderful. Next came a small cup of soup. Again, it was excellent. When she took the first bite of her entree, Patricia moaned in almost orgiastic delight. She looked at David and said, "Oh, David, this is the best meal I have tasted since I was a girl. The ambassador is perfect. Thank you so much for insisting I come with you this evening. I think I could die happy right now." After their excellent meal, Patricia was sipping her after-dinner port and savoring her dessert. David looked at her and said, "Patricia, I know I promised you we could go to a movie. I just don't want to do that now. Would you be upset if we went dancing instead? If you really want to go to the show, though, we can." Patricia felt fear grip her stomach when David asked if they could skip the movie. She was sure she had embarrassed him, and he wanted to get her home as fast as he could so he could forget this evening ever happened. She had learned how to act in nice places when she worked with her parents, but she didn't feel comfortable within one any longer. When she heard David ask if they could go dancing instead of to the show, she got the most dazzling smile on her face he had ever seen. She said, "Oh, yes. I'm not a very good dancer, but I would love to dance with you, David." Of course, Patricia expected David to take her to some bar that had a small dance floor. Instead, he took her to one of the most expensive nightclubs in town. By now, she was so used to his selections for the evening, she didn't make another scene. She was still reluctant to enter, however. Neither of them was by any means an expert dancer, but they danced and they had fun. Patricia's eyes sparkled, and she had a constant smile on her face. After they had been there a few minutes, one by one several men came up and asked her to dance. After she got over her surprise at them asking, she became very firm. Not one of the men that asked her got to dance with her. If she and David didn't dance, then she sat the number out. Finally, near 1 p.m., David said, "Patricia, I need to go to the restroom, then I suppose we need to call it a night if that's okay?" Patricia smiled and said, "Fine, I'll be right here. I don't need to go again, so I'll wait for you." There was a line to get into the facilities. It took David nearly 15 minutes to get back to Patricia. When he returned, he found a large, flashily dressed young man trying to get Patricia to dance with him. She told him no twice after David got within hearing. The man was reaching for her arm to pull her onto the floor. David heard him say, "Come on, honey. I know you are new here and don't know me, but no one refuses to dance with me. I'm Jared Richmond." He smiled at her. David walked up and said, "Hey, buddy. The lady said she didn't want to dance. Now why don't you go back to your table before there's trouble?" The young man looked at David and snarled, "But out a hole. This lady and I don't need you butting into our business. She's going to dance with me for a while, then we'll see if she still wants to be with a loser like you." Patricia looked at David in relief and said, "Oh, David, I was beginning to wonder where you were. Can we just get out of here now?" The man had gotten a grip on Patricia's arm, and he looked at her, then David. He said, "No, you can't get out of here. I own this club, and I intend to dance with you. You'll leave when we're through." The man raised his hand over his head and snapped his fingers. A bouncer looked at him and began moving toward the three. Once again, the man turned toward David. He said, "As for you, a-hole, I told you to get lost. Now move on before you get into more than you can handle." Patricia looked at David, then turned to the man holding her. Her foot flashed, connected, and her assailant doubled over, howling in pain. His hands moved to cup his nearly crushed nuts. Patricia spun on her heel, and her raised foot connected with his face. His head rocked back with the shock of the kick, and he collapsed onto the floor, upsetting a table as he fell. Two very large bouncers had arrived and grabbed David and Patricia. David and Patricia were held until the ambulance and police arrived. They were taken to the station for interrogation. Finally, at nearly 6 a.m., they were released. The police had taken statements from those who had seen the conflict and decided to release Patricia, pending the decision of the prosecuting attorney. Mr. Richmond had wanted to press charges for assault, but the preponderance of evidence indicated he was the aggressor, so they released Patricia and David after their questioning. By the time they arrived home, the help was opening the business for another day. All those who could see David's truck stopped and stared as he and Patricia got out of it. They had never seen either of them dressed up, and especially not in what they could tell were horribly expensive clothes. After they got into the house, Patricia turned to David and collapsed into his arms, crying mightily. She blubbered, "Oh, David, I'm so sorry. We had such a wonderful date, then I ruined it. I'll understand if you never want to go out with me again." She lay her head on his chest and her hand beside it as she felt him pull her to him tightly. David said, "Shush. I had a great time right up until you had to take care of that a-hole. I was about to punch him out when you took him down. That was awesome. I hope you never get angry with me. Now don't worry about it. I'm going to make him sorry he ever screwed with us." Patricia looked up at David in surprise as he gently led her into his bedroom. They were asleep almost before they had covered themselves. When the two lovers did not come to the office, John came looking for them. He saw them cuddled together sleeping and smiled before he returned to work. Later that morning, John and the help had time to read the papers left by their customers and found the news article about David's and Patricia's arrest. They were in shock and dying to get the story from the horse's mouth, as it were. About 2 p.m., the two came sheepishly into the office, where the next 30 minutes were spent answering questions and telling about the evening. Later that afternoon, Patricia heard David on the phone. She did not know whom he was talking to, but she heard him say, "I don't care. I want that a-hole to suffer. I want him hurting, and I want it now. File whatever lawsuits you have to file for me and for Miss Sprightly. What he did is bullshit. You know, if he did that to us, he has probably done it to others. See if you can find out if there are more women he has done that to. Get them involved if there is, and you can talk them into joining our lawsuit. I want him crucified." Patricia was aghast. She had never seen that side of David. He seemed like a totally different man when he was talking on the phone to the attorney. His eyes were steely and his face was set in a mask the likes of which she didn't want to see ever again. When she turned to leave the office door, she saw John standing behind her. John smiled and said, "Come on, Patricia. It sounds like David has things well in hand. I sure wouldn't want to be in Richmond's shoes with David as angry at him as he is. That man goes for the jugular when he gets his balls in an uproar. I've seen that look before in combat, and it always bodes ill for the opposition." Patricia shuddered because when she looked up at John's face, she saw David's look echoed there. Her men were out to protect her for sure, she thought. When David came out of the office, he walked straight to the cooler and took out a bush tall boy. He didn't say a word as he walked out of the store and down toward the river. His face was still filled with the stress and determination John and Patricia had seen while he was talking on the phone. They looked at each other and started to follow him from the store. As she walked out the door, Patricia looked at the two clerks there and said, "You two need to handle things for a while. I don't know when we'll get back." By the time the two siblings caught up to David, he was standing on the riverbank watching the stream flow past. It was obvious he did not see his surroundings, however. He had that look only a few recognize, the look of eagles as they contemplate their prey. David chugged the remainder of his beer, crushed the can, and tossed it into a receptacle. Patricia walked up beside him and put her arm around his waist. Without thinking, David wrapped her in his arm. She laid her head on him, and they stood looking out over the river. Neither spoke a word. It was a time when words were not necessary or desired. John stood a few feet behind them for a moment, then turned and returned to the store without saying anything either. He grabbed 2 more beers and a Pepsi for Patricia and returned. By the time he got to the river, David and Patricia had walked down the gravel bar and were standing in the water up to their necks. David leaned down slightly and gave Patricia a gentle kiss. He pulled back and they looked into each other's eyes for a moment, then moved to kiss once more. John was trying to decide whether to say something or leave when David saw him. When David jerked and turned his head toward the bank, Patricia did the same. They pulled apart. They turned to look at John, so he smiled and raised the drinks toward them. David and Patricia left the stream hand in hand. The 3 friends sat in chairs underneath a large beer-drinking tree and watched the river flow by. Patricia had moved her chair as close to David's as she could, and from time to time one or the other of them would reach out and gently touch the other. One or another of the 3 occasionally made a comment, always about their business or someone they knew, but there were many periods of very companionable silence. Finally, David turned to look at the other 2. He began talking seriously, with many pauses as if what he was saying was painful. In fact, it was obvious he was discussing painful times. "You know, when I came back home, I hated the world almost. I had every intention of throwing together a shack here and living like a hermit. I didn't want to see or talk to anyone. All I wanted to do was live my life in comfort. I had lost my parents and my grandparents in the years just before I came home. I had 2 nasty breakups with semi-serious girlfriends. My fiancée left me 6 weeks before the wedding. We had been having trouble because she wanted to party and spend everything we made and more. I wanted to enjoy life, save money, and visit at home with friends. I had almost decided to break it off with her, but wanted to give it another chance. We went to Miami for a week where I hoped to reconnect. She left me there in the middle of our first night without even a note. I worried she had been injured or kidnapped for that week, and most of 2 more before I finally saw her coming out of her office with another man. I found out she had done things like that in the past to other lovers. It almost killed me, and I decided to sell out and move back here. I was fed up with the city, the a-holes in it, and my job. When I came back, I spent several weeks here cleaning up and working on my house. I had planned to purchase a canoe or john boat to use on the river. One day I decided to rent a canoe and take a day off since I hadn't done it yet. I had to go to Jared because the other places didn't have any left. David looked up at Patricia and continued. I saw Patricia for the first time that day. Well, not really. I had seen her driving on the road and in town, but only from a distance. I was upset watching her work that day. Jared just sat on his fat, but swilling beer while she loaded my canoe and so forth. Karen was sitting with him doing her nails. I remember sitting in the truck cab, and Patricia tried to get me to talk. David smiled and glanced at the 2 once more, then went on. I was almost pissed enough at her to tell her to shut up. All I wanted was peace and quiet like I remembered the float to be. I ignored her, looking out the window, and only answered when I felt I had to. I was getting ready to unload on her when I caught myself. I remember thinking, you a-hole. You're getting ready to dump on the poor girl when she's only doing her job. You noticed she got no help from the other 2 a-holes at the rental office. She's just trying to be friendly. I remember lifting my head to look at Patricia and saw hurt in her eyes. I think she could tell I was pissed at her, and I felt like a prick. I felt like some of the a-holes I had left New York to get away from, the ones who would snarl and throw their weight around to those who they felt were their inferiors. I think that was the day Patricia started to heal me. We didn't talk that day, but I felt like it was a major victory just to keep from snapping her head off. I pushed off into the river as fast as I could, and when I was out of sight, I just lay back and floated with the current. It was so quiet, so serene. I could hear the insects and small animals rustling in the growth along the bank. From time to time, a fish would jump and birds would flit around and sing. Mostly I hurried through the sunny spots, but I lingered in the shadows. I felt the anger and tenseness flow out of me and run off downstream. A few days later, I was working one morning and remembered Patricia. I don't know why, but I just put my tools up and went back for another canoe ride. David smiled and looked over at his two friends once more, then continued. That time I got into the truck with Patricia and talked to her. I don't remember what we talked about, but it wasn't like talking to a woman in New York. It felt more real. I felt accepted for what I was, and it was a relaxing, enjoyable conversation. There was no tenseness, no probing for deeper meaning, no trying to show how important one or the other of us was. I didn't get the impression I was being interviewed to see if I was rich enough or had a good enough job to be pursued. The conversation was just what it was, a visit between two nice people that were enjoying the day and the ride. I felt the bands around my heart, around my soul loosen even more. Every time I took a canoe trip, I felt myself relax and reassume my original personality. I began looking forward to my canoe trips, and in fact, I took more than I planned on and than I should, and it was mostly because I enjoyed talking to you, Patricia. Then when you came here and asked if you could work here for room and board, I almost blew it. I knew by then you had a tough row to hoe, but you took me by surprise and my mind flashed back to New York. I remembered Kathy and how she treated me. She and my other two lovers had also asked to move in with me and offered to help with expenses than they had dumped on me. You had almost left before I could jerk my mind away from those 304s and remember you weren't like them. I had seen you work your butt off for scraps, and I knew you wouldn't shit on me like they did. I knew you weren't offering your body up to me, and, truthfully, that was what they had done. They felt like if they slept with me a few times a month, I should be glad to pay for everything. None of them even offered to pay for anything, and you almost didn't move in because you felt like I didn't need to pay you for your work. I think that was when I began to fall in love with you, Patricia. Patricia gasped and looked over at David when he said he loved her. She levitated from her chair and jumped into David's lap. She wrapped her arms around him and snuggled as tightly to him as she could, then gave him a kiss. He gently pushed her back a little and looked into her eyes as he continued. I have watched you and been with you every day since then, and I find myself falling deeper and deeper in love with you every day. David glanced over at John, who was watching the two with shock on his face and his mouth slightly open. David looked once more into Patricia's eyes and said, Patricia, I know I'm damaged goods and I am not perfect by a long shot, but I came to realize last night when I saw that a-hole bothering you that I loved you dearly. Patricia, would you marry me? Patricia was crying as she pulled David's face to hers and began kissing him. Between tears and kisses, she cried, Yes. Oh, yes, David. Oh, God, I love you too, and I never in my whole life thought you would ask me to marry you. John had moved from his chair and was standing beside David and Patricia. His hand was out and he said, Congratulations, you two. David, when I first came out here, I had already decided you were an a-hole and taking advantage of my sister. I was prepared to kick your butt and only barely held off from just hammering you when we started talking. I was so ashamed when within minutes you had invited me to live in your house, then I became more ashamed when I got to talk to Patricia and found out about your deal with her. She even told me you refused to ever go upstairs after she moved in. You told her that was her refuge and you didn't belong. Then I watched the two of you dancing around each other for nearly a year. Even a blind man could tell you were in love. I think I was as happy as you were when I saw you in bed a couple of weeks ago. I know you don't need it, but David, you have my permission to marry Patricia, and I want you to know she could not have done any better in my opinion. David looked at John and said, Thanks. He took his right arm from around Patricia and reached into his pocket. He rummaged around for a moment with a look of alarm on his face. Then he found what he was searching for and relaxed. When he pulled his hand from the pocket, he opened it and showed Patricia an engagement ring. Patricia, I will go buy you a new ring if you want me to, but I would really like you to take this one. It was my mother's ring, and it would mean a lot to me if you wore it. When I got engaged to Kathy, my parents were still living, or she would have gotten this ring and tainted it with her deceit. On second thought, she probably would have refused to wear it at all because it wasn't flashy enough and was just an old ring. I like to think this ring is infused with the love and the soul of my parents' marriage. I have rarely seen a couple who I thought were more in love than my parents, and I hope we can have the same type relationship. Patricia smiled and slowly held her left hand out so David could slip the ring on her finger. She smiled and said, "Oh, David. Yes. I'd be proud to wear your mother's ring. I can't imagine ever finding a better ring than this. We might find one more flashy, larger and shinier, but we would never find one that meant nearly as much to me as this one does." The three friends were walking back toward the store when they saw a shiny new Cadillac tearing down the driveway ahead of a large billowing dust cloud. The car rocked to a stop near them. The driver sat inside while the dust cloud billowed past the car and enveloped the three in its gritty obscurity. After most of the dust settled, a large man with silver hair stepped from the driver's door and another, slightly younger man from the passenger seat. They both looked around with disdain, then walked up to the three standing there. The driver looked them up and down, then said, "Do you work here?" David started to speak, but John beat him to the punch. He said, "Yes, sir, I work here. What can I do for you?" The man turned to face him and continued talking. He said, "I'm looking for a David Dyer. Where is his office?" Before John or Patricia could speak, David stepped forward and said, "I'm David Dyer. How may I help you?" The man looked at David and almost sneered with disgust. He ran his gaze up and down David's frame, noting the wet, raggedy shorts and shirt, the muddy shoes, and his unkempt appearance. David could see the attitude growing in his mind. Finally, he spoke, saying, "You can drop your lawsuit against my establishment and my son. I don't know how you can justify filing a harassment suit against my son because he asked some little crumpet to dance, but I came to warn you that if you don't drop your attempt at legal blackmail, you will be in a world of hurt. I will hammer you into the dirt, and you will blow away like this damn dust." The passenger turned to the driver and said, "Buddy, I need you to remember what we talked about. I'm your attorney, and we need to keep this businesslike." Patricia opened her mouth to say something, and David snapped, "Patricia, that's enough." David turned and walked into the office and picked up his cell phone. As he came out the door, he stopped and took a picture of the vehicle, making sure he got the license plate in the shot. He walked up to the four standing glaring at each other and took a picture of the seething man and his alleged attorney. After David had taken the pictures, he dialed his phone and began talking. He said, "Solange, this is David Dyer. Let me talk to Steve, please. I have a situation here we need to take care of right now." "Ah, crap. Okay, can I call him there, or does he have his cell with him?" "Okay, I'll try that." David looked up and was surprised at the look of almost fear tinged with respect he saw in the attorney's eyes. He said, "Steve's over at the Taylors. You know they have crappy cell service there, but if I can get him, he's only a couple of miles away." David dialed and began talking almost immediately. "Hey Jimbo, how's it going?" "Yeah, say, I hate to butt in, but I have a little problem over here." Solange said Steve was over there and I am in need of his wise counsel as soon as possible. "Okay, thanks." There was silence for a moment, then David began talking once more. He explained what had gone on and the conversation with the men. Then he said, "Okay, yeah, we're at the office. Great. See you then. Steve is on his way over. Why don't we all go over there in the shade and have a seat while we wait on him?" About 10 minutes later, another nice Cadillac pulled up beside the one there. This time, however, there was almost no dust to tend with. Another handsome silver-haired man walked up and stood beside the group at the picnic table. David stood, then the rest of them stood also. David smiled and shook hands as he said, "Glad you could get here, Steve. Sorry for interrupting the Jabberfest with Jim and his crew, but this gentleman wants us to drop the lawsuit against that Richmond a-hole. I thought you might like to get involved in that discussion." When David called the man who had bothered Patricia an a-hole, his father's face got more red and angry looking. The attorney's face tightened, and he looked almost scared. Before anyone could say anything else, Steve Dawson began talking. He said, "Okay, David, I'm here now, and even though this little visit isn't appropriate, perhaps we can come to some type of agreement." Steve turned to the attorney and continued, "I am rather surprised that you would act in this manner, though, Martin. I was sure you had more ethics than this has displayed." Well, no matter. Let's get started, shall we?" Steve took his seat and turned to Mr. Richmond and his attorney. He continued talking. "Now what's this about dropping our lawsuits, and just what are you offering us if we do such a thing? I know Mr. Dyer is furious and embarrassed about the treatment he received, but he is even more upset and worried about the treatment Miss Patricia Sprightly had to endure both in your establishment and in the police station. As I am sure you know, they feel strongly about their position and demand satisfaction. In fact, Patricia's brother John was so upset he almost..." When Steve mentioned John's name, Mr. Richmond's head whipped around, and he glared at him. Then he looked at Patricia. He flushed and seemed to sink into his seat. He said, "Patricia and John Sprightly? Oh shit. Are you the children of Thomas and Linda Sprightly?" Is this all about the stock they had in my club? John looked surprised, then glanced at Steve before he answered, Yes, they were our parents. What's it to you? And what are you talking about stock anyway? Mr. Richmond said, Crap, this just gets worse and worse. He turned to his attorney and continued, Thomas and Linda are deceased. These two here are owners of a third of the club. I gave their parents that third ownership for loaning me the money to open it. I have been trying to get the money ahead to buy them out for years, but between our expenses and the way Darlene likes to spend money, I haven't been able to. Crap, how are we going to clean up this mess? Not only will they be suing themselves with this lawsuit, but if they win it or drag it out, we may lose the business. Richmond turned back to the Sprightleys and said, Well, if this is about the money, you can just forget it. I don't have it yet. I've just barely been able to pay salaries, so you just don't have anything coming to you. Now can we just drop this whole mess and get it over with? Patricia was looking surprised and John was glaring at the man as he spoke. He said, You mean your club is the S&N Enterprises that we have stock in? I found that certificate just before I went to Iraq, but when I asked about it, none of the stockbrokers I talked to knew anything about it. I had been meaning to see if I could find out anything after I got back, but I have been too busy around here. Richmond looked down and whispered, Screw me and my big mouth. Then he looked up at them and continued, Yeah, I worked for your parents in their restaurant, but I wanted to expand the bar and have a nightclub also. They only wanted a quiet little bar and the restaurant. I was going to leave and go out on my own, but I couldn't afford it. I don't know why, but one day your father offered to help me, and we rented the building next to the restaurant for me to open the club. Of course, when your parents died and the restaurant sold, I lost my favorable rent and had to move. That almost caused me to close, but we held on and now we are doing well. This lawsuit, though, will hurt badly even if you don't win. The publicity will keep many away, and if you do win, it could cause me to have to shut down. You're just going to have to forget about any money from me. Mr. Richmond looked at Patricia and asked, Did my son really say what you allege in your lawsuit? Did he actually try to drag you onto the floor after you had told him you didn't want to dance? You know, he and the bouncers all claim you were willing to go with him until Mr. Dyer returned to your table. This whole thing was just a setup, wasn't it? Patricia began to talk. She nodded her head yes and said, Yes, he did try to force me, and he wasn't too gentle about it either. He bruised my arm, he held me so tightly. David spoke up then saying, You know, the police have statements from some of the people sitting at tables around us. I think you know he really did what we said he did. Surely as a businessman, you know, if he did this to Patricia, and if he did, or does it to other ladies, you will eventually begin to lose business. No one wants to go out where they or their dates will be treated like that. Mr. Richmond sighed and said, I know. We had some trouble with him while he was in college, but he doesn't do that now. In fact, I think the women that accused him of bothering them were just trying to dip into our pockets like you are. We are better off and more visible than his peers, and money grubbers are coming out of the woodwork all the time trying to get a piece of our change. Mr. Richmond's attorney whipped his head around, and he placed his hand on his client's arm. He said, Richard, you need to watch it. You promised you would let me negotiate. Steve was sitting at the table smiling. He said, I need to discuss this with my clients. Would you excuse us for a moment? The three friends and their attorney rose from the table and walked around the building. They stood in the shade while they discussed the afternoon's revelations. Steve said, If you two do own a third of the establishment, Mr. Richmond is right. You might be cutting off your nose to spite your face by pressing this lawsuit. I don't know the value of the club or even the amount your parents gave him, but if they have to close because of this, you could lose your stake in the club. Of course, if they have a good enough insurance policy and we win a large enough settlement, that might not be a totally bad thing. Really though, from what you told me and what the witnesses say, I can't see you winning more than a token amount. If the publicity adversely impacts the club, then you could end up losing more than you gain. He sighed and asked, Well, what do you want to do? Should we try to negotiate a settlement, drop the lawsuits, or what? Patricia and John looked at each other, then at David. John said, Sis, it's your call. The a-hole was messing with you. Hell, we haven't received a dime from them in the 3 years since Dad and Mom died, so even if we do drive them into bankruptcy, what have we lost? You do what you think you want to do. Patricia moved to David and wrapped her arm around him. She looked up at him and asked, David, honey, what do you think? Well, I'm no expert and I would really need to see the books to make any kind of judgment, but I think this is a bunch of bullshit. A club like that in New York, one as busy as that one is, would be a goldmine. I think he chose not to pay you because you weren't hounding him for your share of the profits. He is either skimming, holding a lot of cash in the club's accounts, or he is paying out way too much in salaries to someone. I would bet that someone or those someones are him and or his family. I suggest we demand to see the books first off. I think we, excuse me, I think you should tell him you want to have your CPA go over the books to see why you haven't been receiving your share of the take and to determine what your action will be on the lawsuit. Even if you decide to drop the lawsuit against the business, you may still have one against the kid on, what's his name? Oh yeah, Jared. David turned to Steve and asked, what do you think, Steve? Well, it might weaken our case if we release the club from the lawsuit. I do think it is a good idea to look over the books and to get an appraisal of the business, though. David was staring into space. Finally, he turned to John and asked, John, do you have any of those papers where you can get to them pretty fast? Well, I have a box of the folks' business papers upstairs. I don't know what's in them for sure. We just cleaned out their house and office when they died, and I boxed up the stuff. We had to sell everything almost to pay off their bills. They didn't have enough insurance to cover their medical treatment after the accident, and almost everything they had went to that. Then I screwed up and put the few $1,000s left over into a joint account for Patricia and me. I never thought about my power of attorney allowing Karen to clean it out while I was in Iraq, so... Well, as you know now, we have nothing unless by some accident this turns out to be valuable. John, why don't we go see what we can find right quick? David turned to Steve and continued, can you and Patricia keep them busy until we get back? See if you can get them to make some kind of offer, maybe? The four took off on their respective errands. After about 30 minutes, David was smiling. He had found the stock certificate and a letter from Mr. Richmond thanking the Sprightleys for their confidence in him. It referenced the attached stock certificate for 1/3 of the shares of S&N Enterprises and served as a receipt for the $40,000 paid for said stock. The certificate was for 400 shares, par value $100 per share. Now they knew how much John and Patricia might lose in the venture if the business closed. David sat back and looked at John, then he said, John, without seeing the books to check on cash flow and profits, I can't make a final call, but if they own the building... Wait a minute, let me check something. David grabbed his phone and the phone book. He looked up a number and called. This is David Dyer. I'm an investment banker, and we are negotiating with S&N Enterprises. They allege they own the building at 1724 Industrial Avenue in Springville. Could you verify that and let me know of any outstanding liens? Yes, I'll hold if I may. A few minutes later, David began to smile and he said, Yes, son, Yes, I understand. Thanks. David turned once more to John and said, They own the building, but there is an outstanding loan on it for $1.17 million. The appraised value for the property is $750,000 for tax purposes. With the real estate situation as it is, I almost bet they owe more on the building than it would sell for if we forced a sale. The two friends walked back to the office and motioned for Steve and Patricia to join them. He reported what he had found out on the phone and showed them the paperwork he found in the box. He looked at the three standing with him and began talking. I used to work in the investment world and like to think I have a good working knowledge of finance. Having said that, and admitting that I worked on the bond desk, I have some thoughts about this mess. Your parents let Richmond have $40,000, and if I understand correctly, there has been no payout to you or your family on that. I still think he is using your money and has no intention to pay you any profits in the business. I suggest we threaten to press on with the lawsuits or give him the opportunity to rein in his son, drop the countersuits, and buy you out of the business. I don't know if he can come up with any money, but I have my suspicions. The four walked back to the table and took their seats. David looked at the other three and began to speak. My clients and I have an offer for you, Mr. Richmond. We have found some documentation on the funds you obtained from their parents. If I understand correctly, you obtained $40,000 from their parents over 15 years ago and have never made any distributions to them for their share of the profits. We need to see the business books and tax returns for those years to see if this is justified. Additionally, we want to see minutes of the meeting of the board of directors discussing officers' salaries and directors' salary. We also want to see a breakdown of employee compensation to see if it is reasonable. It has been my experience that a business such as yours has an extremely good cash flow and generates substantial profits if operated correctly. I have been in your establishment numerous times, and it is always very busy. My clients and I therefore suggest you give them a cash buyout right now for $200,000 with a breakdown of $125,000 to Patricia, of which $50,000 would be earmarked for compensation because of your son's actions. The other $75,000 would go to John for his share of the missing profits and the initial loan. If you do not agree to this today, we will obtain your books, past tax returns, and file for their fair share of each and every year's profits. Richmond jumped to his feet and began spluttering. His face was pasty white, and he started backing toward his car. What? How dare you? What right do you have to demand my books and records? We are here to get you to drop this harassing lawsuit, not to talk about my business. A business, I might add, that is none of your business. Richmond's attorney looked in shock at David, then he got a sickly expression on his face. He turned to Mr. Richmond and said, "I told you I didn't want you talking. I had no idea. If these people own a significant portion of your business, they have a right to see the books. You have a LLC, don't you? You know you were supposed to see they got a Schedule K1 every year showing the business income they were to report on their tax returns. Didn't you send them the reports?" Richmond looked more white and stammered unintelligibly. His attorney looked over at Steve and said, "Steve, I don't know what to tell you. I think my client and I need to go back to my office and see if we can get to the bottom of this. If you'll excuse us?" After the two left, everyone remained seated, staring into the distance. Finally, Steve got a small grin on his face and he said, "Well, I think we have... No, I think Mr. Richmond has a pretty large problem on his hands. Are you sure you never received AK1 or distribution from S&N?" The two siblings shook their heads no once more. Steve looked around the group and said, "Well, I think I've done all I can here today. First thing tomorrow morning, I am going to send an official letter requesting the books, past tax returns, and other business documents. I will threaten to have the court order such release if they do not voluntarily release the documents. I will also need to know what you want out of this mess now, though. If he does not pay the $200,000 we discussed today, give it some thought, please. If he did not give you the documents like he was supposed to, that means he probably filed fraudulent tax returns and maybe skimming like David thought was possible. At the very least, he is guilty of fraudulently withholding your money if the LLC ever made a cash distribution. If there are significant funds in corporate accounts, some of that is yours, and you can demand a distribution assuming business operations are not adversely affected." It was the middle of the week, almost 3 weeks after their meeting, before Steve got back to the three. He said the business documents had never been received from Richmond and numerous contacts with him had gone unanswered. He wanted to know what they wanted him to do. The three friends discussed their thoughts on the conference call. Then David said, "I think we need to get court orders freezing bank accounts and investment accounts if it isn't too late. I'm afraid they may try to run. I also think we need to contact the IRS and try for a court order on the documents." Steve said he would get on it. The next week, there was an article in the Springville paper about an IRS investigation of a local business, S&N Enterprises, doing business as the Starlight Lounge. The next day, Steve called. After the three were on the line, he said, "Richmond, his son Jared and his wife were arrested last night. They were arraigned this morning on several charges. The ones that might interest you are tax fraud and attempting to flee to avoid prosecution. Both the men were also arraigned for resisting arrest, drug dealing, pandering, and assault and battery. Apparently, the investigators found some other ladies and their dates that had been assaulted in the club. I have filed another lawsuit for you demanding access to business records and distribution of your fair share of the business profits." I managed to view some of the LLC tax returns at his accountant's office, but not all of them. The ones I saw did not show your ownership interest on them. You had been totally excluded, no K1 prepared or anything. I think you will be okay with the IRS, but I am not sure at this point if we will ever recoup any of the funds owed you. If he hadn't opened his mouth at your place the other day, he might have got away with it also. None of his official records showed your ownership. It's a good thing you kept the paperwork. The summer was drawing to a close, and one of the biggest weekends of the season was upon the three friends, Labor Day. They quickly pushed thoughts of the lawsuit and potential monetary windfall into the background of their thoughts as work took precedence. They had all their boats and camping spots rented for the entire weekend. They even had some people renting camping space in an unimproved area along the river. The store was humming, as was the little snack bar. Late-season vegetables were selling like hotcakes. The three had never been happier. Nights were now cool enough that they were sleeping with the windows open once more, and David and John were thinking about getting back into the woods to cut the next year's firewood. They had to cut extra wood now because they were selling some to people who wanted campfires in the campground. All three were making a good living now. Patricia's share came to about $5,000 for the summer, and they thought John would get about $1,000. David was going to get about $12,000. Patricia and John felt badly because David was not receiving a larger share of the profits for the use of the land, but he was adamant that he would not take more than he was getting. As the days passed, their customers thinned out until near the end of the month, they closed the canoe rental. They still rented the fishing boats and camping spaces, but the work was light enough the three of them could handle it alone. They had talked about closing the small store and snack bar, but the day they first closed it, several of the locals came by and were upset it was closed. Some of the campers also wanted in, so they decided to leave it open and see if they sold enough to make it pay. Over the next 2 weeks, they averaged a profit of $50 per day, so they kept it open. As the colder weather came upon them, they stayed busy preparing the cropland for the winter and cutting firewood for the next season. One evening after supper, they were sitting on the porch watching darkness fall when Patricia turned to David. She said, "David, I'm tired of sleeping alone. I want to move into your bedroom, and I want to get married. Can we get married next week?" "Sure, honey. We can get married anytime, and you can move into my room anytime. I had been hoping you would move downstairs, but I decided not to say anything. I figured you would move when you were ready. You need to decide where you want to go for your honeymoon too. That is if John will watch the place so we can take off." John said, "Yeah, things have slowed down enough now I can take care of everything." The wedding was small and simple. There was no family on either side, so they got the local minister to marry them in his church 2 weeks later. All the employees and their families were invited, as were the few friends they had in town. John had arranged for a small reception at their campground immediately after. Their first night of marriage was spent in David's, now their, bed. The next morning after they had awakened, they took off on their honeymoon. David and Patricia spent an idyllic week on the Gulf Coast of Florida at Bradenton Beach. They slept late, loved voraciously, and dined way too well on the excellent seafood. During the times they were not in bed or eating, they spent laying around the pool or on the beach catching some rays. When they got too warm, they would dash into the ocean for a cool, relaxing swim. Twice they got to play with a manatee while swimming. They both loved Florida, but it was not home. At the end of their week, they were both glad to be returning to the hills and streams of their hometown. The day after they arrived back home, the three were sitting along the river watching it flow quietly past. Patricia was sitting on David's lap snuggling. From time to time, she would lean into him and give him a gentle kiss. His hands would occasionally give her intimate areas a gentle caress. John looked over at the lovers and smiled. He said, "Get a room, you two. Sometimes you make me so jealous, but I am happy for you." John looked out over the river a moment longer, then turned back to a blushing Patricia and David. He said, "Have you given any more thought to putting in some cabins, or at least enclosed camp shelters? I think we have enough wood cut for the next season, and we still have enough good weather left to build at least one this fall if we get on it." David leaned back in his chair and pulled Patricia with him. He, too, looked out over the river as he thought once again about the cabins. He knew the three of them could do the construction, but did he really want to go that route? He looked down when he felt Patricia move. She was pulled back a little, watching his face. She had a look of anticipation, even excitement on her face. He gave her another gentle kiss and whispered, "You want to do this, don't you, honey?" "Yes, I really do, but if you don't, I can live with that. I just think we could make good money doing the cabins and, well, I know it would be more work, but not much really. We could have one of the girls act as a maid or hire one, and I am excited about the possibilities." David heaved another sigh and looked over at John. He said, "Well, I really don't want to go that route too badly, but I tell you what, John, you take the cabins on as your project. In fact, I think we need to talk about the responsibilities some anyway. I propose dividing the responsibility for the work and supervision of the employees, much as we have it now, but formalizing to 2. Right now, whichever of us is handy, if a question comes up one of the girls asks us. I think I want a more structured operation than we have now. I may seem hard about some of this, but what I would like to see is this. It is my land and investment. Well, now it's Patricia's and mine. But I want to be in overall control if there is a disagreement or large expenditure of funds. Otherwise, I think John should be the foreman for the campgrounds and any cabins or camping shelters we build. Patricia should be in charge of the marina, store, and snack bar. I will be primarily involved in the farming operation and office work. Of course, we would always help each other out as we do now. For example, when planting the crops, and to some extent harvesting, I will need some assistance. I am sure on busy days Patricia will need help with sales, and you will need help with cleanup, opening, and closing the campsites, John. I just think that unless it is an important decision or large task, we should supervise the people working in those areas and be responsible for those areas, as I have laid out." Comments? Patricia and John sat for a moment. They looked at each other, then both looked at David and almost simultaneously said, "Sounds good. Let's do it." "Okay then, guys. I'll spring for 2 small cabins right now. If you are right and they rent well, I will either build more, or we can put in a couple of duplexes." By the time it got too cold to work outside comfortably, they had the cabins enclosed so they could heat them. That allowed the 3 to finish them during the winter. They were small but verged on luxurious when completed. Both cabins were about 500 square feet and had a small bedroom, bath, small kitchen/dining area, and a small living area with a sleeper sofa. They had a wrap-around porch with comfortable chairs on it. Just before the next season began, they began advertising the improved facilities and the cabin availability. To their surprise, customers began trying to rent the cabins before canoeing and swimming season had arrived. Many people would rent the cabins in March just to picnic and enjoy the outdoors. They began taking reservations for later in the season. They even began taking reservations and deposits on the few shelters and open campsites, especially for the times around holidays and popular weekends. Patricia's eyes were glowing the evening she told her brother and David that all the improved sites, the shelters and the cabins were fully booked for Memorial Week and weekend, the 2 weeks around July 4th and the 2 weeks around Labor Day. She told them that a large percentage of the spaces were booked for the remainder of the summer too. I have even started a waiting list for improved campsites, shelters, and cabins in case one comes open again. I even have some requests for mooring sites for boats. Some people are planning to use their boats to come up from the lake to stay with us. David sat in shock. I just can't believe that. It's amazing. He stared across their little resort and continued, I know the Fieldings Resort is always busy in the hot part of the year, but I never thought we would get so much business here. We're almost a mile upstream from them, and the water is not as deep here. Jim and the boys told me we could fill more spaces and cabins, but I just didn't believe them. David looked over at John and asked, Do you want to take on more work, John? We can build 3 or 4 more cabins if you want to add to your management load. The three talked for some time and decided to begin work on 3 more cabins. They thought they might even finish 1 or 2 in time to get some rentals from them before the end of the season. By July 4th, they had 2 more cabins completed. They even had almost all the time during the rest of the summer booked for them also. They finished the last cabin in time for Labor Day. It took longer to complete the second and third cabin because as they were finishing the first one, Patricia became ill. She had pains in her stomach and threw up a lot. Finally, David forced her to go to the doctor. She came back late in the day and walked up to him. She plastered herself to his frame, wrapped her arms around his neck, and gave him a deep soul-searing kiss. As the kiss continued, it became hotter and hotter. Finally, the 2 lovers pulled away from each other. Patricia was flushed and panting. David's pants were tinted out, and he was almost pawing at the ground. Patricia looked at him, then said, The doctor says I'm fine, honey. He said my upset stomach will go away over the course of the next few weeks, but I'm not going to be able to help you much later this summer and fall. She got an excited, scared look on her face, then continued, Oh, David, I'm pregnant. You're not mad at me, are you? David stood in shock. He moved to a chair and sat down, then he just stared at Patricia. You're okay, but you're pregnant? Patricia just nodded her head yes and watched David. She felt the fluttering of fear in her belly. She began to think, oh, what if he doesn't want a baby? What will I do? How could I do this to him? I can't kill my baby even for David. David began to smile, and he held his arms out toward Patricia. She began to smile. Tears ran down her cheeks and she leapt into his arms. They were sitting there hugging and kissing when John walked onto the porch. John looked at the two and felt fear. He knew Patricia had been to the doctor that morning. He asked, Patricia, David, is everything okay? There's nothing wrong, is there? Why is Patricia crying? David looked up at John and smiled. No, nothing is wrong. In fact, it's very, very right. We're going to have a baby. Over the years, the family and the business grew. David added a room on downstairs to use for a nursery. Over time, he and Patricia had a total of 3 children. As they aged, they helped in the business. The vegetable sales grew until they began selling produce commercially to a local grocery chain. The resort and food service business grew until they kept it open year-round. John finally met and married a young widow. They built a small home on some land they had purchased along the river that abutted David and Patricia's farm. John continued to run the lodging part of the business, and with hired help, he and Patricia operated the lodging and recreation portion of the business. Over the years, the children of both couples began to assist the adults in areas in which they were interested. As the children took on more and more responsibility, their parents did less and less. Of course, all the children attended college and took courses that supported their jobs on the resort. One evening when David was 59 and Patricia was 50, they were sitting alongside the river. In the distance, they could hear happy shouts of people enjoying themselves at their resort. They watched as their children and employees completed yet another day's work. Now they and John and his wife only worked when there was special need of their services, when the children needed advice or help with a particularly vexing problem. The rest of their time they spent in semi-retirement. From time to time they traveled, but mostly they just lay around their resort and enjoyed life. David turned to Patricia. He reached for her hand and held it as he stared into her eyes once more. He said, Honey, even after all these years, I can't believe how lucky I am to have found you. I am still so thankful you came to me that day on the river. I always knew I had made a mistake when I took my MBA and went to work on Wall Street. Sometimes I think I need to go look up the a-hole who broke up my engagement to Kathy again and thank the 2 of them. If they hadn't dumped on me, I would never have been as happy as I have been these last 30 years. I love you more and more as the years go past. I hate it when we are separated even for a few hours when one of us goes to town without the other. I had heard for years about finding your soulmate, but, well, I think I fell in love with you even before you moved out here but was too hurt by those 304s in New York to see it. We hadn't even gotten married though when I realized we were truly soulmates. I feel so complete when we are together and so empty, like a part of me is missing when we are apart. Every day I love you more. Patricia looked over at her man and smiled. She said, I know I have told you this before, but you know I was in love when I came to you. I just didn't know how deeply I loved you. A few times when I almost gave up before you were healed enough to love me back, I despaired. It has all been worth it though. We have this wonderful home and our wonderful family, and most and best of all, we have each other. I can never love another man like I love you. Many of the men that come here over the years have tried to chat me up, and all I felt was a coldness. I could never see them as anything but a customer, even knowing how handsome some of them were to other women. They smiled to each other and reached out to hold hands. While they were staring into each other's eyes, they heard pounding footsteps and a small, shrill voice yelling, Grandma, Grandpa, Mommy Sayed, I can come down to the water and be with you. We got here early and I can be here all day now. Can we go swimming, please? The little blonde-haired munchkin crawled into Patricia's lap as she gave her a big hug. David watched her give Patricia a sloppy kiss and thought, she looked so much like her mother when she was a baby. If I didn't know better, I would think it was Jessica in Patricia's lap. And she is so sweet to her brother, and her cousins too, just like Jessica was. David leaned back in his chair and had one more thought before he went in search of his sons and grandsons. He knew it was almost time for their regular family meal, held each Sunday afternoon. Many times not all were there, but there was always a large crowd. He smiled as he walked, thinking, the old saying is right. When life throws you lemons, smash them and make lemonade. Dear listeners, please share your thoughts in the comments section below, and don't forget to like, share, and subscribe.